Even the gods and goddesses of Olympus needed a day off. Sometimes they needed time away from the constant bickering and never-ending controversies of their family. On one such day, Wisdom and Moon found themselves discovering a hidden gem within the city that never slept, and meeting a familiar blonde knucklehead with a penchant for the color orange.
"I'm glad we did this. It's been so long since it was just the two of us," Athena said, a content smile on her face as she walked the streets of Manhattan. Being one of the busiest out of her family, she took the time to enjoy the rare days she had off, where she could decompress and let the responsibilities of godhood slip away from her shoulders. Dressed in regular clothes like the mortals her family ruled over, she tried not to stand out as she walked the stone streets of New York. To her right, her sister Artemis walked beside her. The daughters of Zeus took solace in each other's company, the similarities between them helping to form the bridge between their close sisterly relationship in their early days of existence. Out of all the gods and goddesses on Olympus, Athena felt her most comfortable when she was with her younger sister. There was no game with Artemis, and no need to keep one eye over her shoulder. The bonds of sisterhood were strong between them, and Athena knew she could rely on Artemis to have her back. "I agree, though I'm not usually one for the concrete jungle of New York. I'm enjoying our quality time together. It's been months since it was only us," Artemis replied. Like her sister, she was dressed in casual mortal clothes, giving up her usual silver parka and camouflage pants. Her lieutenant, Zoe, could handle looking after the hunt for an afternoon and had her utmost trust to keep the girls in line. "I would give anything to stay away from Olympus right now," agreed. "Hera is on the warpath again, and I have no desire to be in her way," Athena replied. Her last memory of the queen was watching the beautiful woman storming towards Zeus's temple, the earth cracking beneath her sandals and her eyes, radiating godly power. She didn't need to be the goddess of wisdom to understand what was happening. Whenever Hera found out Zeus had cheated on her again, all of Olympus fled from the incoming war zone. Nothing good came from an argument between the king and queen, and no god or goddess had any desire to get wrapped up in the quarrel. Even Hestia would slip away and make herself scarce. Despite their feelings on the matter, the Olympian daughters of Zeus couldn't fault Hera for her outbursts and shouting matches with her husband. Hera's temper was legendary. "People wonder why we remain virgins and refuse to take husbands. Case in point," Artemis joked, pointing up to the sky, and making her sister laugh. Seeing Zeus's volatile marriage to Hera would turn most people off of the concept of marriage. When one half of the married couple was not as committed as the other, then it made said marriage redundant in their eyes. From what they could gather by the volatile arguments Zeus and Hera got into on the winter solstice, Zeus had fathered a little girl somewhere in California 3 years ago, and the mother had brought her to Manhattan. Her name was Thalia, named after one of the muses, and was the first child born to their father since before World War II. Their father and their uncles had vowed to never sire another demigod. It was their effort to avoid the next great prophecy from coming to fruition. No one expected the vow to last, and unsurprisingly, Zeus was the first one to give in to his lust. The king of the gods had no luck when it came to keeping it in his pants, and his willpower towards beautiful women was weak. It seemed to be a trait that ran in their immortal family. They weren't sure what happened to the pair, but they were turned away at the door of the Empire State Building by the guard. The chill of the December month nipped at their skin, though the feeling didn't bother the pair of goddesses as it did to mortals. They'd walk the streets for a couple of hours, conversing like they would with complete comfortability with each other. It was a couple of days after the winter solstice, and the mortal holiday Christmas had been days earlier. The streets were bustling with people, filled with mortals taking advantage of the post-Christmas deals. Mortals were very focused on having the latest product of just about anything and everything in today's era. They wondered if Aphrodite had something to do with that. They wouldn't put it past the goddess of love. Speaking of the goddess of love, the daughters of Zeus ensured they weren't followed by the daughter of Uranus, spreading their essence throughout the world, making it harder for anyone to locate them. Aphrodite had a habit of showing up in the middle of their sisterly days out, taking over completely and forcing them to go to the places she wanted to go and do the things she wanted to do. While Athena could tolerate being around Aphrodite, the day would usually end up with Artemis and Aphrodite getting in an argument. It would always start with Aphrodite throwing an off-handed comment her way, and Artemis taking it as an insult. On more than one occasion, Athena had to physically restrain the goddess of the moon, and call upon Hestia to take Aphrodite back to Olympus before the two goddesses went at it. In terms of fighting capabilities, Artemis was the superior fighter in every way and was one of Olympus's best fighters. However, Aphrodite could be deceptively cunning, and being the youngest daughter of Uranus, she boasted greater raw power than both of them. A battle between love and the moon could only result in utter chaos on a global scale. "I'm feeling hungry. We could see if it's safe to return to Olympus. I bet we could convince Aunt Hestia to whip us up something," Artemis asked, a gleam in her eye. No one loved their aunt's cooking more than Artemis. Athena thought about it. "I could go for something, but let's stay in the city for now. I have no desire to run into Hera, or father." we'll be there for hours if they try to talk about their problems with us. Agreed. Do you have anywhere in mind? Not particularly. Perhaps we could. Athena started, but stopped when something caught her eye. What's that? Artemis hummed, turning in the direction Athena was looking in. They were somewhere in the West Village, and her sister's attention was solely on the small building that stood on the corner of 90th Bedford Street. It looked like any other building in the West Village, but the front of the restaurant on the ground floor stood out next to the grey-coloured stone. In particular, the front of the building was made mostly out of glass but was met by a bright orange frame and door that stood in the centre of the building. An open sign hung behind the glass door, and across the frame sat the name of the establishment, The Fox's Den. The Fox's Den. I've never heard of such a place. Neither have I. And I know every building and store in New York like the back of my hand. It must be new, Athena said back, her curiosity piquing. Shall we? Artemis made a motion with her hand. Led the way, sister. Led she did, with the two goddesses making their way towards the Fox's Den, interest piquing their thoughts. Well, for Athena at least. Artemis, on the other hand, was just hungry. She felt like she could eat course after course right now. A bell went off when they walked through the door, a shroud of warmth blanketing over them and making the sisters hum in content. It was well lit and open and appeared bigger than either anticipated. Along the wall on the right were a couple of booths, while more than a dozen round tables with comfy-looking chairs scattered across the room and next to the windows. A counter stood at the side with a swinging door leading into another room behind it, with a glass cabinet sat next to it. Inside, Artemis spied cakes and other delicacies of all shapes lined up neatly in multiple rows. The smell of rich and freshly made pastries wafted through the room, accompanied by a mix of coffee and chocolate. The delightful aroma made both women shiver in delight, reminding them of Aunt Hester's treats back on Olympus. They quickly realized it was more of a cafe diner than a restaurant, but neither looked like they minded. Will this do? Athena asked, and tried not to laugh when she found her sister staring into the glass cabinet, her face pressing against the glass. Despite her reputation, Artemis was a child goddess at heart. It all looks amazing, Artemis whispered, admiring the delicate frosting that coated the carrot cake. Athena leaned down next to her and had to admit they all look amazing. Sometimes, it amazed her at the handiwork of mortals. While she wasn't known for possessing as strong of a sweet tooth as Artemis, she liked to treat herself every now and again with something sweet. Thank you for the compliment. Athena's eyes trailed away from the sweet treats and found an amused young man looking back at her from over the counter. His chin rested in his palm, and a big grin sat on his face. Most would never dare to lean so close to her, much less Artemis, but it wasn't like he knew who they were. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Artemis tense up, and her facial expression turned colder than before. Her silver eyes bore into the man's blue ones with quick intensity, as if silently telling him not to come any closer. Her silver eyes gently glowed in warning, though only enough for Athena to notice. To the man's credit, he didn't look affected. He looked more amused if anything by Artemis and reached behind the counter and pulled out two menus. Here, these are for you both. Take your pick where you would like to sit, and I'll be with you shortly. He straightened up, getting rid of the grin and giving the goddesses a polite smile in return. Thank you, Athena politely replied, and led Artemis away by the wrist to a nearby table by the window, whispering, "Stop glaring." Artemis shook her head. Sorry. He surprised me, that's all. I didn't realize someone was behind the counter. Well, you were close to drooling over the carrot cake he had in there. I can't blame you, Athena teased, silently laughing as Artemis's cheeks had a tinge of gold wash over them in embarrassment. Not a word, Artemis replied, giving her sister a pointed look before both opened up their menus. The first thing that caught their attention was the variety. There was a lot to choose from, far more than other cafe diners they visited. Some of the choices were unique to witness for this type of establishment. Looking around, the room was half full, and Athena gazed across the tables to see what people were eating. Most were drinking coffee, which didn't surprise her, but she spied a couple of meals. In the corner, she saw a gentleman eating eggs Benedict, and by the moans coming from his mouth, he was enjoying his food a great deal. Looking over her menu, she failed to hide her smile when she looked at her sister. Artemis looked lost in the options, her silver eyes twinkling. If Athena was betting a person, she bet her sister was devouring the options in the dessert and cakes section. When a few minutes passed, the man from the counter appeared by the table, a small notebook in his hand. No longer standing behind the counter, Athena and Artemis got a good look at him. If they had to guess, he looked the same age as Athena in her current form, somewhere in his mid-20s. He was blonde with bright azure eyes. His skin was tanned and looked like he belonged on a beach somewhere in California. He was tall, around the same height as Apollo and Hermes in their mortal forms, and was built lean. He was dressed in smart casual wear, with dark jeans and a white shirt, and around his waist was a black apron with the logo of the diner on the front in orange. At first glance, They thought he was a son of Apollo since he had the typical traits of their brother's demigod children. However, getting a sense of the man, they couldn't sense any godly connection that a demigod typically had. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Fox's Den. My name is Naruto. It's nice to meet you both, he introduced and glanced at Artemis. I'm sorry if I startled you earlier. Artemis narrowed her eyes up at the man but saw no ill will in his gaze. It's fine, but you didn't startle me. I was just engrossed in your selections in the cabinet, that's all I see. Thank you for the compliment though. I'm glad you liked what you saw. His words sounded sincere, and Artemis couldn't sense him playing any game. He didn't appear bothered by their beauty, unlike others in the room who kept glancing at them from the corners of their eyes. It wasn't every day two beautiful women of their standard walked into a place like this. Perhaps he would be tolerable. Did the owner make them all? She asked, nodding in the direction of the cabinet. Most of them, yes. Some came from the suppliers, but most of them are from my hands, he admitted. You're the owner? I am. Artemis didn't say much else. He felt her gaze linger on him before it slipped back to the menu. He took that as his cue to move on and turned to Athena. Naruto, you say? Athena asked, leaning back on her chair and appearing amused by his name. Her grey eyes sparkled with curiosity. It's rare to meet someone with a Japanese name, and yet doesn't appear to hold any ties to Japan, he laughed. I guess you could say my parents had a flair for exotic names. I see that. I must say, your menu is unique. It's not like other menus you see for a cafe diner like this one. Athen mentioned. Any reason for that? She didn't know what she expected for him to say, but she didn't expect him to shrug. Not really. I'm fortunate enough that I've traveled the world and learned all types of different delicacies each country has to offer. I did think about creating a restaurant, but I've always preferred cafe diners. I find them to be more intimate and gives you more of a chance to get to know the people that visit. Athena nodded. Did you ever get a chance to visit Greece? I happen to be Greek myself, bor. Kevrika tonxrono mustin elitha poly evtsaristo, icon, and I found my time very enjoyable. Both Athena and Artemis looked surprised at his sudden language change. It wasn't often they met someone in New York who could speak Greek. It wasn't a language most people chose to learn, unlike French or Spanish. Getting over her surprise, Athena gave him an appraising look. I'm impressed. You speak well, and fluently, thank you. It took a long time, but I finally managed to catch on, he replied, before clicking the top of his pen. Are you both ready to order? I think so, Artemis muttered, giving her sister a pointed look before looking back at the blonde. I'll take a hot chocolate, with a slice of the carrot cake. Could I also have a dash of vanilla in my drink, please? Absolutely, he replied, before adding, would you like whipped cream and chocolate sprinkles on your hot chocolate? I would. Yes, I'll take a latte please. Like my sister, I'll have a dash of vanilla in my drink. And may I ask, what is your special dessert of the day? Athena asked. Her interest peaked when she saw that little nugget on the menu. Of course, the speciality today is a lemon curd Italiano semifreddo, he told her and failed to hide his smile when he saw her eyes sparkle. She liked the sound of that. That sounds wonderful. I'll have that, please. Naruto nodded, and wrote down the order. Absolutely. You're in luck. We ran out an hour ago, but I've got the next batch almost ready. It will take about 10 minutes if you don't mind waiting. It's proved to be very popular today. That would be fine. Athena nodded and watched him walk away. When he walked back behind the counter, she turned to her sister and noticed her silver eyes gazing straight at her. What? I didn't say anything, no. But you look like you want to say something. It's nothing. I'm just noticing how chummy you were with the man. Athena rolled her eyes and scoffed. I was merely caught off guard by the way he spoke Greek. It's not every day someone in New York can speak fluent Greek. If he can learn a second language, and open up his own business, it means he's got one of these. Athena poked the side of her head. Plus he's the only one not leering in our direction, which is nice, I swear. If that man in the corner licks his lips in my direction one more time, I will throw this knife straight into his eye. She picked up the knife and toyed with it between her fingers. You know I would. Oh, I know you would, sister. Athena laughed, plucking the knife out of her sister's hand and putting it back on the table. The last thing she wanted was her sister to make a scene. Artemis huffed and tried to look annoyed at her sister, but started to laugh along with Athena as her sister gently kicked her under the table. We should do this more often. It's nice to get away from everyone, I agree. It's not like my hunters are incapable of looking after themselves once a week. I think once a week would be lovely. It wasn't long before they were interrupted by the blonde barista, who placed their drinks on the table in front of them. Both goddess looked impressed with their orders and recognized the signs of someone taking care and pride in their work. Artemis did her best to keep her face from drooping as the delightful smell of her hot chocolate wafted around her nose. It smelt just like the hot chocolate Hester would prepare for her. Athena had a similar expression on her face, wrapping her hand around the warm mug. When he placed Artemis's carrot cake in front of her, the goddess licked her lips, her sweet tooth craving for the treat. While Naruto prepared Athena's order, the two quietly drank their drinks, both relaxing into their seats as the taste touched their lips. Both let out a sigh of delight, impressed by their orders. It was easy to make a bad drink, but it was difficult to make a great one. So far, they would give the barista credit where credit was due. However, when Artemis had the first bite of her carrot cake, Athena couldn't help but giggle as her sister started demolishing the baked good. "I take it the cake is good?" she asked, but didn't get an answer. Her sister was too engrossed with the cake to reply, her mouth too full to form words. A thumbs up would suffice. When he returned, he was surprised to find both Artemis's mug empty and her plate void of any cake. "Wow, I guess you liked it, huh?" he said, before motioning to her nose. "You have a little something on your nose." It was whipped cream from her drink. Artemis's eyes widened and swiped at her nose with her palm. She stared at her sister with irritation, hissing, "I had whipped cream on my nose. Why didn't you tell me?" Athena laughed to herself. "I thought you'd realize eventually," she teased, before noticing the plate in his hand. "For me," he nodded, "for you. I hope you enjoy. Let me know if I can get you anything else," he told them, and started to leave before he saw Artemis looking his way. "Can I get you another drink?" "Same again, please." "Drink and cake," she said, making him smile and head back to the counter. She looked at her sister and noticed her looking down at the plate, her fork in hand. Artemis wasn't one to praise a mortal often, especially a male mortal. However, she had to admit the lemon curd Italiano semifreddo he made looked divine. It looked like something you'd find in high-class mortal society. Hell, it was something she imagined Hera serving at her temple. "Well, aren't you going to try it?" "I want to, but I feel like it would be a shame to ruin it," Athena whispered, admiring the delicate work that must have come with making it. She was no incredible chef like Hestia, Hera, or Grandmother Rhea, but Athena occasionally liked to dabble in the kitchen the mortal way. She found there was something therapeutic about cooking, and she understood why so many mortals took it upon themselves to learn. It must have taken him years of practice to achieve such quality of work. It took a moment, but slowly Athena dug her fork into the lemon curd. The texture was light and fluffy, and she watched it jiggle around as she brought it up to her mouth. Taking a bite, Artemis watched as Athena fell back against her chair, her rhythmic breathing making her sister lean forward in anticipation. Judging by the expression on her sister's face, the dessert had gone over well. Her composed elder sister rarely let her cool visage slip, always retaining a mask of dignity that kept her true feelings behind closed doors. Athena wasn't the kind of goddess that wore her feelings on her sleeve, but Artemis was one of the few that could see behind that visage. It was always a pleasant experience for the goddess of the moon to see her composed sister drop all pretenses and enjoy something for what it was. Then, out of nowhere, Athena let out a loud moan of delight that caught everyone's attention. Okay, that might have taken it a step too far. The whole room fell quiet, and every mortal within the establishment, male and female, gaped and blushed in Athena's direction. Artemis couldn't stop the flush of gold from lacing her cheeks. She gawped at her sister, looking between her and the plate. Even she wasn't that bad. It sounded so sexual. "Hey Athena, what in the name of Hades was that?" Coming to her senses, Athena couldn't stop her eyes from widening. "It's not what you think." That was a lie and she knew it. The moment she realized what she had just done, Athena brought up her free hand up to her mouth in shock horror. She didn't dare look around the room at the gaping mortals, but the blonde owner was in her viewpoint, and she could see his surprise and disbelief. "I can't believe I just did that," she thought. Never in her more than 4,000 years of existence had she ever publicly done something so candid. What made it worse was doing it in public. "What the hell is wrong with me?" She hit her face. The embarrassment worse than the time she tried to play the flute in front of the other gods. When he walked back over, Athena didn't dare look him in the eye. After he provided Artemis with her second round of orders, he stopped and whispered to Athena, "I'm glad you enjoyed it." He smiled politely, and before she could reply he walked away. Oh God, what must he have been thinking? "Hey, Blondie," he stopped and turned around, and everyone looked towards an older woman who was sat a few tables over. She pointed at Athena. "I'll have what she's having." Athena groaned and hid her face in her hands. She wished the earth would swallow her up for eternity. What a day. When the last customer left the fox's den, Naruto breathed a sigh of relief as swapped the open sign to closed. Seeking the comfort of the nearest chair, he finally had a moment to put his feet up and let the day wash over him. Whoever thought running a business would be stressful? Not him, that's for sure. Other people made it look so easy. Not to mention, the movies made it look like a piece of cake. He could with all confidence say that it was not easy. Catching Tora the cat on a D-rank mission was easier. However, as stressful as the job was, this was the path he chose to acclimate into modern-day life. As it turned out, he was very good at it. Cooking and baking had always been a hobby of his, and something he found therapeutic. Feeding fulfilled a survival need for all living creatures. and the feeling of fulfillment came not only from the good of the act of giving but also the fact that we have helped in some form. Cooking for others helps bond human beings to loved ones and fellow humans. At least, that's how he saw it. There was also the fact that people loved cake and coffee. Both played huge parts in humanity's daily life that it seemed like a given. Rubbing his forehead with his forearm, he clapped his hands together. All right guys, you know what to do. The door that led to the kitchen in the back room swung open, and 3 of his shadow clones marched out in a single file, giving the original Naruto a salute as they started the evening's cleanup. The evening had been a busy one with the post-Christmas rush. A lot of families had stopped by and spent the majority of the evening, as well as couples of all ages enjoying the post-Christmas bliss and exploring the post-Christmas deals throughout the city. Perhaps he should have opened up in the new year like he originally intended. At least, that way, he could ease into modern life a little easier, without having to deal with the Christmas holidays, and all it brought with it. Humanity sure had changed, though. He did notice the festive and seasonal beverages went over a treat with his customers, and he was already thinking about what to do once January arrived. Humanity sure had a sweet tooth. Well, at least no one has complained as of yet. Everything seems to have gone over well. With that thought, his mind turned to a memory from earlier that day. The image of the 2 beautiful sisters that entered his establishment crossed his mind. Both women were equally as pleased with their orders, though one was certainly more vocal than the other. Naruto had almost dropped the other woman's order when the moan of pure delight reached his ears. He was no blushing virgin, but the fact remained it caught him by surprise. He was aware food could be an aphrodisiac, but he didn't think it was to that high of a degree. The sisters had stayed for an hour after that, with the one with grey eyes remaining silent for the remainder of their stay, too embarrassed to say another word, while the other demolished another 2 servings of hot chocolate and carrot cake. Where the auburn-haired sister put it all, he didn't know, but it was impressive to watch. Anything he put in front of her vanished within minutes. Not since Elagabalus of Rome had he seen someone devour his culinary wonders with such gusto. Heck, even Elvis in his later years had some form of restraint. What a peculiar pair of women they were. He hoped they came back again soon. Watching his clones wipe down the tables, and take the empty plates and cups to the back, he stood up and stretched his back, humming in wonder as he felt those necessary pops in his back. Taking the broom out of the closet, he got to work in doing his part before heading home for the night and doing it all over again tomorrow.
Athena, come on, we need to hurry, Artemis called out, her patience wearing thin as she paced around Athena's library. I'll be a moment more. Just wait 1 more minute, Artemis, you said that 5 minutes ago. Don't you understand time is of the essence? The response the goddess of the moon received back was a delicate laugh from her sister, accompanied by the sound of one of Athena's many rolling ladders connected to the hundreds, possibly thousands of bookcases that housed Athena's books. If one was to imagine what the personal library belonging to the goddess of wisdom looked like, all one had to do was imagine the New York Public Library, and then magnify it many times over. Only then would someone begin to imagine how endless and ever-growing it appeared to those who were not the goddess herself. Even Artemis, after thousands of years of visiting her sister in her temple on Mount Olympus, still required the aid of Glaucus, Athena's companion, to navigate her way through. If it were any other occasion, then Artemis would be in a more patient mood. However, it had been 3 weeks since their last outing together, and Artemis had been counting down the minutes for their next trip to her new favorite spot in the city. Their plan to spend sisterly time together once a week hit a pair of road bumps called Zeus and Hera, with the 2 elder gods pulling them away the moment they returned from their last outing weeks ago. Neither Athena nor Artemis had much time to spare after that. When they weren't fulfilling their duties to their godly domains, they were on Olympus, aiding their aunts in playing peacekeeper between the king and queen. It was frustrating to no end, but neither could find the right opportunity to slip away without being noticed. Now, 3 weeks on, some form of normalcy was beginning to return. Although Zeus was still forbidden from entering Hera's temple, the queen had finally ceased in stirring up a shouting match with her husband. In everyone's minds, the month of June couldn't come quick enough. Pacing within Athena's temple, the goddess of the moon knew why Athena was stalling. Her embarrassment from their first visit was still fresh in their mind, and Artemis was well aware her sister did not do well with embarrassing situations, especially when she was at the center of it. For what must have been the first time in her immortal life, Artemis was looking forward to delicious food that was made by a member of the opposite sex. Who knew miracles could happen? I swear to Hades, Athena, if you don't hurry up I'm leaving without you. Don't you understand she could appear at any moment? She's done it before. Fine, fine, I'm coming. True to her words, the sounds of Athena's rolling ladder grew louder, and the goddess of wisdom appeared on Artemis's right field of vision. She was stood on the mid-step, carrying half a dozen books tucked between her arms. To Artemis's relief, Athena was already dressed for their outing to the mortal world, her dark hair neatly tied up in a high ponytail. Though it only took a click of their fingers to change their attire, the younger of the two goddesses wasn't willing to waste another second. "I can finish these later, let's go before you wear down my floor with your constant pacing." Athena had barely stepped off the ladder and discarded her books when she felt her sister grab a hold of her wrist and proceed to drag her out of her temple. "Honestly, Artemis, I'm more than capable of walking by myself." Athena didn't get a response back. She quickened her pace, bringing her level with her younger sister, and noticed her silver eyes darting between bookcases. "You don't remember the way out, do you? You keep changing the layout. Just stick to one design and keep to it." A laugh escaped Athena, before gently escaping Artemis's grip and taking the lead between the two sisters. "Follow me." Having designed the latest layout of her library, she could understand why other members of her family found themselves lost within her temple. An underlying rule on Olympus was that gods and goddess don't teleport directly into each other's temples. Their temples were like their own personal and private space, a place they could escape from the world, and from the crazier members of their family. However, despite the no teleporting rule, it didn't stop the more annoying members from waltzing through the front doors like they owned the place. Artemis was one of the few Athena gave express permission to enter her temple, knowing her sister would not exploit or betray her trust. "You need to make a map of this place. It would make life a lot easier," Artemis muttered, though she perked up when she saw the exit. "What? And run the risk of Apollo or Hermes getting their hands on it? Not a chance." Their younger brothers, Hermes in particular, could be notorious pranksters if the chance arose. The two male gods were arguably each other's best friend despite their rough start when the god of messengers stole Apollo's cattle. Since then, the two were as thick as thieves, and two of Olympus's biggest playboys. The idea of them getting a hold of her library's layout sent shivers down her spine. Her spear would run with godly itcher if the pair ever tried anything. As soon as they were out, Artemis's pace quickened as they headed for the golden doors to Athena's temple. "Come on," she ushered, trying to get her sister to walk faster. "I don't know where that damn Aphrodite is, but I don't want her catching us. I don't know how she does it, but she's sneakier than some of the deadliest creatures I hunt. She has this habit of appearing at the most inconvenient moment." All right, Athena replied, her heels clicking against her temple floor. "I don't think I've seen you this excited in a long time. That mortal has certainly left an impression on you." "Don't read too much into it," Artemis insisted, her eyes never leaving the set of golden doors as they got closer. "His establishment provides a warm and comforting aura, and it's nice to be in the presence of a male that didn't spend the entire time leering at us. It's a refreshing feeling." A dusting of golden itcher washed over her cheeks. "His food and hot chocolate were nice too." A bark of laughter escaped Athena. "I think we both know you liked it more than that. What were the words you used after we left?" Athena tapped her chin. "Oh, that's right. It feels like someone poured ambrosia and nectar all over our tastabuds and covered us in a warm blanket." I don't remember saying anything like that." "Funny, because I do." "Why yes, well," Artemis stuttered, as she pressed her hand on the doors and pushed it open. At least I didn't let out a loud and sexual moan after a single bite of lemon curd." This time it was Athena's turn to splutter in surprise. It was not a sexual moan." "Yes, it was." "No, it wasn't. Besides, how would you know?" "Don't turn this around on me." The two sisters narrowed their eyes at one another. Though close, the sisters did have the odd tiff, as rare as it was. As Artemis prepared to throw another barb her sister's way and Athena was trying to come up with an excuse for her past action, the rich smell of perfume hit the pair of goddesses like a ton of bricks. Their bodies froze and slowly turned their heads in the direction of the door, where a haze of pink smoke enveloped the doorway to Athena's temple. Neither could say a word as the very person they were trying to avoid being caught by appeared in all her stunning glory, currently possessing baby blue eyes that shined as bright as sapphires, with bouncy dark chocolate curls that hung down to the middle of her back. The goddess of love was midway through knocking on the door when she noticed Athena and Artemis standing in her way. Aphrodite blinked in surprise, but soon became a bundle of joy as she clapped her hands together, seemingly oblivious to the frozen stares she was getting. "Oh, how wonderful. I was about to come and find you both, but you've saved me the trouble," she said, reaching forward. Neither Athena nor Artemis could do anything as Aphrodite looped an arm through each of their arms and marched them out onto the streets of Olympus. "Let's have a girls' day, just the three of us. Won't that be terrific?" The goddess of love wasn't giving either of her fellow goddesses a chance to back out. This was happening whether they wanted it or not. As their senses returned to them, Artemis shot Athena a look of betrayal as she realized the predicament she was now stuck in. "I told you this would happen." All Athena could do was sigh, and thank the fates that Aphrodite hadn't appeared seconds earlier. Stretching his arms out in front of him, the blonde owner of the Fox's Den found himself leaning against the counter as he stared out the window and across the street. Trying to repress a yawn from breaking out, he turned and looked across the inside of the den, taking in the people that were visiting. It had been a slow day compared to the last couple of weeks, But with Christmas over and children returning to school and adults returning to work, a routine was beginning to form through his weekdays. Saturday was always going to busy, while Sunday he was only open for half a day. Even he needed a break and time to rest. Boy, the last hour is dragging right now. He was in the middle of the slow period. The afternoon rush during lunch had proven to be one of his business periods of the day, some opting to stay in while others chose to take their food away with them and find a quiet spot to eat in solitude away from the bustling streets. It was a few minutes past 2, and the people slowly filtered out until the room was only a third of the way full. It wasn't that he wasn't enjoying the peace, but there was something about the pressure from the swarm of people all coming in at once that got his blood going. In the back room, he knew his clones were hard at work. At least that's what he was hoping anyway. Even after all this time, his clones still had a habit of doing things their way when they got antsy, but those moments had become few and far between. These days, they did as they were told, and he was thankful for it. Noticing a hand waving at him from one of the tables next to the window, he smiled and walked over with his notepad and pen in his apron pocket. "Another black coffee for you, ma'am?" he asked, watching as the young blonde woman stared down at the papers spread out on the table. From what he gathered, the young woman was in the middle of her training to become a teacher. Math, if he remembered right. She'd come in 2 hours ago, during the lunchtime rush, and had yet to leave. Every time he looked her way, he found the woman biting down on her pencil, leaving tiny grooves in the wood. It looked like she was preparing for an exam if the papers were anything to go by, with notes and scribbles covering the blank spaces. "Yes, please." She picked the mug up and held in his direction, her eyes never leaving the paper. "How are you getting on?" "I can't say math was ever one of my fortes." "It's going fine. I'd be better with another cup of coffee," though one of his eyebrows went up, but he said nothing. Instead, he took the mug and went through with her next order. Despite professional courtesy, a small part of him was tempted to add a dash of chili sauce to the drink. Rude as he fulfilled the order, little did he know, at that same moment a street over from the fox's den, the three goddesses of Olympus converged on its location. "No, no, Macy's is that way." Aphrodite pointed in the direction opposite to the way they were walking. "I saw the most beautiful pair of Gucci heels. That would look great on you, Artemis." Every woman needs a pair of knockout heels. Why couldn't Artemis understand everything she was trying to do was ultimately for the betterment of the moon goddess? "Let me help you." Biting back a curse, Artemis pulled the struggling love goddess along the pavement. "And I told you, I don't need a stupid pair of heels. I'll take a pair of sandals or combat boots at any time of the week. Besides, Athena and I already made plans before you stuck your nose in." "But we know, then, how ab no." Sighing, Athena turned and looked at the annoyed expressions on both goddesses' faces, though each for different reasons. "Aphrodite, you don't have to stay. You can go, and Artemis and I will continue our day without you." Huffing in annoyance, Aphrodite yanked her arms out of Artemis's grip and crossed them against her chest. A pout appeared on her face, but she knew there was nothing she could do to change her fellow Olympians' minds. "Fine, but this place had better be as good as you're making it out to be." "It will be. It better." Aphrodite watched as Athena's and Artemis both suddenly stopped and stared up, coercing her to do the same. When she did, she found herself looking at the most sickly shade of orange she could imagine, with a name written across it. "The Fox's Den." She turned her attention back to the two goddesses. "This is where you wanted to go. If you want to go to a cafe, I know a great little place in Paris. It's a terrace cafe at the western end of the Ile de la Cité." "No, this will do fine," Athena retorted, not allowing Aphrodite to usurp their day off. Before Aphrodite could reply, Athena cut her off. "Aphrodite, trust me when I say you're going to like it here." Opening the door, Athena eagerly walked inside, the bell ringing off and followed closely by Artemis, whose tongue was poking between her lips when she spied the cakes through the window. Realizing it wasn't going her way no matter what, Aphrodite relented and followed after them. Fine then, she hoped it would be worth it. The second she stepped through the doors, her negative thoughts melted away as a wave of warmth covered her body like a warm comforter, and the rich smell of chocolate and coffee enveloped her senses. The delightful aroma forced Aphrodite to stop in her tracks, and take a moment to bask in the glow she was feeling. Her eyes hovered across the room, taking everything in from the shade of the walls to the fixtures hanging from the ceiling. "Oh, how quaint." She clapped her hands together, eliciting an eye roll from Artemis, though Athena seemed pleased at the reaction. "It smells divine in here. I can see why you wanted to come here." Skipping forward, she mimicked Artemis's actions from the first visit and pressed her dainty hands against the glass cabinet. "These look delicious," proving her point. She licked her lips and tapped her fingers on the glass. As Olympus's leading authority on anything relating to chocolate and sweets, she was enjoying what she saw and smelled. "Those eclairs look to die for." "Welcome back," the three heard. Looking over the counter, Aphrodite found herself locking eyes with another pair of bright blue eyes as Naruto reappeared after returning from the back room. He wiped his brow, and smiled at the three women, and nodded his head towards Aphrodite. And you brought a friend. It's nice to meet you. Hello, handsome. Athena and Artemis's decision didn't seem like a bad one anymore. She understood why they were so eager. She would be too if he was the one serving them. Blonde hair and blue eyes, tall and lean, nice complexion and works in a cute cafe. Mama likes. The goddess of wisdom smiled at the blonde, ignoring the looks Aphrodite was giving the owner, and watched as he gathered 3 menus from behind the counter. To Aphrodite's surprise, even Artemis wore the tiniest smile on her face. Gone was the usual cold or indifferent mask she'd seen her fellow goddess wear when in the presence of a male mortal. What in the world? It's nice to see you again, Naruto, Athena said, accepting one of the menus as he held them out to the 3 goddesses. Not wanting Aphrodite to be aware of her nerves on returning to the establishment, Athena buried those feelings away and behaved as she typically would. We hope to come again sooner, but responsibilities tend to get in the way. You know how it goes. I sure do, and don't worry about it. He waved it off. Your table from before is free if you want it. Or would you like to sit elsewhere? Scanning the room, it was Artemis that spoke. May we take a booth? She pointed to the back of the room, where all the booths were currently available. Sure, make yourselves at home. I'll be over in a couple of minutes, thank you. Heading towards the table, the trio of goddesses weaved their way through the interior, ignoring the stares they were receiving from the other patrons. Aphrodite couldn't help but give a wink to a cute-looking man sitting on his own close to the restroom and giggled when he nearly choked on his drink. Slipping into one of the available booths, Artemis claimed one side, while Athena and Aphrodite shared the other. I think I'm beginning to see why you girls like it here, Aphrodite said, making herself comfortable and slipping off her jacket, revealing a snow-white cardigan that showed off her perfect form and curves. The owner is a bit of a hunk, don't you think? Neither Athena nor Artemis replied, and soon, Aphrodite found herself holding back a giggle, amused at how serious they looked as they read the menu. What are you thinking, Artemis? Carrot cake again? Artemis shook her head. I'm not sure. It was heavenly last time, but I feel like I should try one of the others. Red velvet, maybe? There was too many to choose. That's a good one, though. It would be hard to beat Aunt Hestier's red velvet cake from 7 years ago during the summer solstice. That's what I was thinking, but I'm tempted. I think I'll pick a hot chocolate again, though. Artemis looked up from her menu, her silver eyes staring into Athena's grey ones. Are you going with the lemon curd again? Aphrodite noticed the thick gulp by the goddess of wisdom and watched her bring the menu up close to her face. And no, not this time. Besides, that was a special of the day. I doubt he will have it again. I might go for something a little different. Watching the back and forth, Aphrodite's lips formed a tiny O shape, listening to her fellow goddesses converse. She wanted to know what the fuss was all about. They talk as if it's the best thing in the world. Like many of Olympus's goddesses, Aphrodite had wined and dined in the finest establishments humanity had to offer, whether it was the high society life of the rich and famous in Hollywood, New York, Paris, or London, and being catered to by the best chefs that ever lived. Aphrodite couldn't understand why Athena and Artemis were getting lost in the menu the way they were. Surely it wasn't that good. It was just a cafe diner in the middle of West Village. They weren't even on the Upper East Side. Not to mention no one in the world could compete with the delicious delicacies that Hestia, Hera and Mother Rhea were known to create. It just wasn't possible. Opening up her menu, she scanned through the first page before her eyes widened. Wow, look at that menu. There was so much to choose. Her favorite cafe in Paris didn't have a menu anything close to this. Oh, today was going to be a good day. The table fell silent, each goddess finding themselves as wrapped up in what to choose as the other. Beneath the table, all 3 tapped their shoes against the hardwood floor as the choices ran through their minds. None of the 3 Olympians looked at each other, their eyes glued to the options. Athena had her eyes narrowed, Artemis was eagerly licking her lips, and Aphrodite was busy biting a nail. What to choose? As expected, after a couple of minutes passed, all 3 felt Naruto appear by their table, his notebook and pen in hand and giving them all his trademark smile. Thanks for waiting. Are the 3 of you ready to order? Looking around the table, the blonde owner turned to Athena, deciding to start with her. Straightening her back, Athena cleared her voice. I believe so. She looked at the pair and saw them nod, though Artemis still looked a tad unsure. I'll take a latte please, though instead of vanilla. May I have a dash of cinnamon this time? She watched him nod his head and write the order down. And I remember seeing someone with eggs Benedict the last time I was here. I'll have one of those, please. Absolutely. Those are all great choices. When he turned to Artemis, the goddess appeared to have finally made her mind up. I'll take a hot chocolate, and this time, I'll get a slice of the chocolate coconut cake. Sure. What kind of hot chocolate would you like? I'm sorry. Artemis looked at the man in surprise and watched him scratch the back of his head. Oh right, sorry. I forgot you haven't visited in a few weeks. I've added a couple of different types of hot chocolate, besides the standard type you'd expect, and I'm waiting on the new menus to arrive. Would you like to hear them? Artemis said nothing and nodded. New types of hot chocolate. She hadn't prepared for this. Well, right now I have 6 types, but I'm planning on bringing in more over time. Naruto held out his fingers. We've got regular, rocky road, mint chocolate, white chocolate, salted caramel and orange chocolate. Each flavor made her eyes gleam, though one in particular stood out. I'll take the salted caramel. You got it. And don't forget the whipped cream and sprinkles. I would never be so cruel, he joked. Across from Artemis, Athena smiled at her sister's eagerness. No matter how cold or intense Artemis could become when crossed, the moon goddess would always be a child at heart. Even Aphrodite, who so desperately wanted to tease the younger goddess, couldn't bring herself to do so. She looked so cute and not at all like the huntress that struck fear into monsters everywhere. When he turned to Aphrodite, the love goddess batted her eyelashes at him. I'll take strawberry milkshake please. She lifted a delicate finger and pointed to something that caught her eye. I couldn't help but notice you have a section of entremets on the menu. I do. Yes. Her smile widened, and leaned forward on the table. It's rare to find that type of dish outside of France done well. Most people tend to overpower one layer too much, causing the rest to suffer. You've sparked my curiosity. Her hand came up and rested in her palm, purposely posing in a way that enticed most men she met. Next to her, Athena and Artemis frowned. I'm no connoisseur, but I've spent a great deal of time in Paris and around France, learning the language. So, I know how a good entremet should taste. The blonde owner listened and smiled. If it helps you in making a decision, then you should know I learnt how to make entremets during my time in Paris. Aphrodite's eyes shined at that piece of information. Take your pick, and I'll make it my duty to knock your heels off. Very well, challenge accepted. Winking up at him, she briefly looked across the selection before making up her mind. That one. The apple spice one please. Good choice. After he finished noting the orders down, he bowed his head to the 3 ladies, though kept his eyes on the love goddess. Je reviendrai avec vos commandes sous peu. I will return with your orders shortly. A short gasp escaped from Aphrodite's lips as she watched him walk away. Before long, it was replaced by a smirk and gleam in her eyes that her fellow Olympians had seen one too many times. You didn't say he spoke French? This mortal got better and better by the second. Athena looked equally as surprised. I didn't know. Though he does speak Greek, and he did say he'd traveled around the world, perhaps I should have foreseen the possibility that he could speak numerous languages by that information alone. Athena leaned back against her seat, ignoring Aphrodite's surprise, and watching him from the corner of her eye. He's a very surprising mortal. It had been some time since a mortal had piqued her interest in such a way. That was one more thing she could say that she liked about the blonde. He's might be the only male mortal I can tolerate, Artemis added, before narrowing her eyes at the love goddess, which is why I forbid you from trying to take him to your bed. What? Hey, you can't do that. Aphrodite whined, leaning forward and stared directly at the younger goddess. Besides, who's to say I would? Next to her, Athena scoffed. Don't think we don't recognize that gleam in your eyes, Aphrodite. We know how you operate, she warned, stealing her grey eyes. And I concur with Artemis. Don't get any funny ideas. Who I bring to my bed is my business, not yours. Well, I like coming here, so I'm making it my business. Why don't you stick to your Girl Scouts, Artie? Why don't you stop corrupting every tolerable male out there? Maybe you'll notice more of them if you spoke first, and shot an arrow later. How about you close your legs for once instead of acting like a 24/7/11 kick? Artemis's eyes widened, before leveling the love goddess with a glare. Did you just kick me? In response, Aphrodite did the grown-up thing and stuck her tongue out at the moon goddess. All right, that's it. Kicking the love goddess back in return, the 2 women spent the next couple of minutes kicking and stamping each other's legs, with each swing getting harder and more creative than the last. It would have been a comical sight watching the 2 beautiful goddesses squabbling if Athena hadn't manipulated the mist around them. To the eyes of the mortals around them, all they were seeing was the 3 women conversing casually. I should have known, Athena thought, observing the 2 squabble like children, both amused and annoyed at the same time. She could feel a headache coming on. The 2 were the polar opposites of each other, and they never failed in bringing out the worst in each other. Subtly, Athena moved any cutlery away from the moon goddess. She didn't need her sister getting any creative ideas. The moment she saw Naruto returning with their orders, Athena intervened and mimicked the actions of their Aunt Hestia and how she would stop the 2 from their petty arguments. She lurched forward and with both hands, grabbed an ear from each goddess and gave them a hard yank. Ow, hey! Before either could say another word, the returning blonde reappeared by their table. Here you go, ladies, enjoy. Placing their drinks in front of them, he followed up the action with Artemis and Athena's food, and turned to Aphrodite. Your order will be right out in a moment thanks, she replied, rubbing her ear and shooting a glare at Athena, who was smiling her thanks at Naruto. Once the pain in her ear passed, Aphrodite found herself gripping the straw of her milkshake. As she hoped, it was in a tall glass with whipped cream and rainbow sprinkles coating the top of the drink, and a small strawberry delicately placed on the rim. It smelled divine. Looking around the table, she found herself looking in amazement as Athena sunk into her seat, her latte cupped in one hand while the other held her fork. She looked completely and utterly at peace as she took a bite of her eggs Benedict. It was an expression she rarely saw from Athena, barring the occasions the goddesses of Olympus would commune around Hestia's hearth. Across from her, the annoyance slipped away from her occasional rival goddess, whose silver eyes lit up like a child on Christmas morning. Watching Artemis, she had to hold back a laugh as a moustache made of whipped cream coated her top lip, while her hand brought up a piece of her coconut cake, which looked incredible. She wanted to tease her but decided to leave it be. Puckering her lips, Aphrodite took a swig of her drink and blinked as the sweet drink enveloped her godly tastibods. It was neither too thick nor too thin, and walked that fine line between too sweet and not sweet enough. To put it bluntly, Aphrodite thought it was one of the best milkshakes of her life. Holy Mother of Rhea, that's good, she whispered, loud enough for Athena and Artemis to hear her, the former of who smirked as she enjoyed the taste of cinnamon in her latte. For the next minute, the three sat in silence, with Aphrodite swaying her legs from side to side beneath the table, her head resting in her palm as she relished in the taste of her milkshake. Oh, she was coming back for sure. She could see herself becoming a regular if everything was as good as this. She was so wrapped up with her delightful drink that she didn't even sense Naruto appear beside her and lay a plate in front of her. She was about to speak but found her words lost on her as she gazed down at the plate. Oh my, enjoy. Walking away, Athena and Artemis looked up from their dishes, staring at the love goddess as she pushed her milkshake gently to the side, her hands clasping together as she stared down at her order. Neither woman could fault since both looked as mesmerized at the sweet treat on the plate. Sat on the top of the incredible-looking orange-colored pastry was a spiral-shaped apple garnish, and cinnamon sticks delicately leaning against the garnish. Like before with the lemon curd, Athena and Artemis thought it looked like something Hera would serve at her temple. The queen of the gods only accepted the best of the best, and the apple spice entremet Aphrodite ordered looked like it belonged nowhere else. Wow, Artemis muttered. It looked amazing. It looks incredible, Aphrodite whispered, picking up her fork and digging into her sweet treat. Part of her didn't want to ruin the beauty of the dish. No one relished in beauty as she did. It was one of her domains after all. Slowly, she took a bite and fell back against her seat at the explosion of flavor. Her lips pursed together, and her fellow goddesses watched as her pupils exploded in a myriad of colors, like a kaleidoscope. I think that's one more person won over. Both Athena and Artemis froze and steadily looked up from their meals. A flush of gold dusted across their cheeks. Across the room, like it did weeks earlier, the whole room went silent, and everyone, Naruto included, stared in Aphrodite's direction. The goddess of love cared little for the reactions going on around her, too busy enjoying her godly tastibods getting overwhelmed by the flavor. Artemis almost chopped on drink. Oh no, not again. At least it wasn't me this time, Athena thought, her fork hanging in the air, watching Aphrodite dig into her meal like a woman possessed. She's worse than Artemis. Bits of mousse covered her lips, and crumps covered the edge of her mouth. Both did nothing but watch as Aphrodite finished off the dessert in a matter of moments. If they weren't blushing from Aphrodite's reaction, they would have been impressed by how quickly she devoured the dessert. Even Naruto, who busy preparing another order, stumbled at how loud Aphrodite was being. Again, he thought, handing the customer their drink. Naruto slowly walked over to the table. On the one hand, he was happy to see he'd won their little challenge. He'd yet to have a complaint come through his doors, and he didn't plan on starting today. On the other hand, did she have to be so vocal about it? His blue eyes gazed across to Athena, giving her a look amplified her embarrassment. I guess you two must be related to her. You're a lot alike, he joked. Athena shrank in her seat, her hands covering her face. Just once, she'd like to come to the fox's den without being filled with embarrassment. Hearing his voice, the goddess of love turned her head, ignoring the fact she had mousse and crumps all over the lower half of her face, and looked at him with widened eyes. Before Athena or Artemis could say or do anything, everyone watched as Aphrodite stood up on her seat, perfectly balanced in her heels and making herself taller than the blonde. The myriad of colors was rampant in her eyes, switching from blue, to green, to brown, and every other color imaginable, though only her fellow Olympians could see it. Is everything okay? The blonde owner started to speak, but was silenced when she rushed forward, slamming her lips against his. His eyes widened and felt a pair of arms snake around his head, her petite fingers threading themselves through his hair and pulling him in close. He could feel her nibbling against his bottom lip, and couldn't help but place his hands on her hips. He didn't know where else to put them. He could taste the apple and cinnamon from the dessert, along with the almonds he added to the mix. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, but he could feel the shocked expressions from his other customers staring at them. The clattering of cutlery dropping was a telltale sign. Aphrodite, that's the opposite of what we told you to do. Both Athena and Artemis lurched forward and grabbed the older goddess, pulling her back and forcing her back to her seat. Artemis looked as if she wanted to wring the love goddess's neck. This was what she was afraid of. You can't help yourself, can you? Artemis hissed. Athena glared at the back of Aphrodite's head. If it was possible, the goddess of wisdom would be glaring a hole into the back of her head. Their anger only intensified when Aphrodite started giggling. She batted her eyelashes his way and blew him a kiss. Say thank you like a normal person. Don't worry ladies, I'm sure he didn't mind. She continued to giggle, ignoring the fact that Artemis looked ready to combust. She wished she had her hunting knives with her. Slowly, her giggling ceased, and the blonde owner watched as she mouthed, "Merci pour le régal, thank you for the treat." She sent a wink his way too. The surprised Naruto stood there staring at the three women, his free hand coming up and touching his lips. He could feel the sensation of her lips still on his, her tongue begging to wrestle with his. Tasting past the dessert, he detected a hint of honeysuckle and had a feeling there were smears of the woman's pink lipstick on his face. How long has it been since that happened? He honestly couldn't remember. Behind him, the bell to the fox's den rang, and Naruto took that as his cue to turn around and leave, ignoring the woman's resumed giggling. He weaved his way through the tables and chairs, ignoring the stares sent his way, and returned to his spot behind the counter, trying to control the blush on his face. Welcome to the fox's den. Letting out a yawn, Naruto rubbed his face as he tried to wipe the sleep out of his eyes. Waking up at 5 am every morning had been a struggle initially. For as long as the blonde shinobi could remember, he'd never been a morning person. From his time in the academy to his days as a member of Team 7, and even during his tenure as the 7th Hokage of Hidden Leaf Village, waking up at such an obscene time was a struggle. These days, being the owner of a cafe diner required him to open up hours before the rest of the world opened their eyes, and get everything ready for the day that lay ahead. He didn't have the luxury of Kakashi-sensei, or later on, Hinata, to wake him up anymore. He could have made a shadow clone and have the clone do it, but he knew if he did that, and remained in bed, he would do it every morning. He didn't want to fall into the trap of beginning a bad habit. It was the same reason he didn't use the Hiration to get to work. Besides, the walk from his home to the fox's den helped wake him up. It was Sunday, which meant he was only open until 2. After that, he planned on going home and sleeping the day away until it was time to restart his week all over again. Walking the streets at such an early time, it would always surprise him to see people much like himself, out and about already starting their day. The sun hadn't even risen yet, and the brisk chill of the air nipped at his skin, reddening his cheeks and the tip of his nose. He nodded his head at a passerby, who was heading towards a nearby ops truck as packages of all sizes were being loaded on and off with great care. Ops, that must be new. Morning, good morning. Rounding the corner, he sniffled when the fox's den came into sight with its bright orange frame, standing out amongst the dull colors of the other building. Didn't people understand if they wanted to attract the attention of the people passing by? Then what better way was there than using the brightest shade of the best color in the world? If nothing else, it would cause people to stop and look. Digging into his pockets and pulling out a key, he quickly entered the fox's den and locked the door behind him. Switching the lights on, he could still detect the lingering scent of chocolate and coffee from the day before. Shaking the cold away, he eyed up the coffee machine to warm him up as he removed his coat and hung it up in his office, which was nothing more than a little hole in the wall room, where he could keep all the legal stuff and keep the computer. Crossing his fingers, he called out his trademark jutsu, Shadow Clone's Jutsu. 24 Narutos appeared in front of him, falling into 3 lines of 8 and offered the original a quick-fingered salute. All right, you all know the drill. The list of what we need to make this morning will be on the countertop. The special of the day won't be anything too fancy, but I thought we'd go with a blueberry sky cheesecake. He watched them nod their heads. The sky yogurt is on the top shelf. If we need any more, Hiration over to Reykjavik and head to that store I frequented when last there. The one nearest to the theater house. They nodded again, forcing him to clap his hands together. All right then, you know what to do. Let's go. Hi. One by one, the clones made their way into the kitchen, the door flapping in an endless loop as each clone passed through. Letting out another yawn, he turned around and started the process of switching the machines on, from the coffee grinder to the espresso machine to the automatic drip coffee makers. While his clones handled the baking in the kitchen, he'd handle setting the place up in the front before joining them. While he was on his own in the front, he made himself a drink while he could. The blonde ninja was fond of a Spanish latte, though instead of sugar, he added a splash of honey. Honey was packed full of natural sweetness and energy, and in his opinion, a better option than sugar. His hands moved together with perfect fluidity thanks to constant repetition. Honey, along with a shot of espresso added to the mix, made him hum in delight as he brought the drink up to his mouth. Now that was the good stuff. When he was younger, he never imagined anything coming close to his love for ramen. However, these days he couldn't imagine a morning without some form of caffeine to start his day. He had a couple of hours before he opened his doors to the public. Once open, he estimated he'd have around 10 minutes before the first batch of customers started filing their way in, likely for a takeaway order. Wandering the earth for as long as he had, the blonde owner of the Fox's Den had become good at reading people. He knew when to talk to his customers, and when to leave them be and let them get on with their day. Disappearing once again into the back room, he returned moments later with a large cardboard box in his arms and placed it down on the counter. Unsealing the top, he got a glimpse of the inside. His new order of paper cups had arrived the day before, and like most things in his life, they were bright orange too. A majority of his customers during the morning rush took their orders away with them, and his paper cups were nothing more than the store-bought cups anyone could purchase. These new ones were ordered and designed for the Fox's Den, with a chibi-styled fox sporting 9 tails in the center drinking a coffee. There could never be too much orange in one person's life. Not to mention, he came to accept it was the little things in life that kept him going. Who knew new paper cups would spot a smile on his face? He hoped Kurama didn't mind having his silhouette as the new logo for his business. His face if he saw these. He'd be so mad, he whispered, staring at the chibi fox on the cup, and letting out a low laugh. He'd never forgive me for turning him into a cute cartoon. Knock, knock, knock. Blinking in surprise at the sound, Naruto turned around and faced the doorway, and found himself staring back at a pair of blue eyes on the other side of the glass. Stood with one hand knocking against the glass, was a man somewhere in his late 20s if he had to guess, and dressed up like a mailman, shorts and all. The man possessed dark curly hair poking out from beneath his hat, with elfish features, and looked like he was in desperate need of a good night's sleep with dark shadows forming beneath his eyes. It was even more evident when the man broke out into a yawn. The man then offered him a wave. Hey, any chance I can come in? Moments earlier we got another delivery come in. It looks like another set of packages have come in for Janice. He's requesting it for delivery at 8 a.m. sharp. Hermes heard, and noticed the heads of George and Martha come to life and turning to look at him. A loud ping followed after, and Hermes couldn't stop the groan from leaving his mouth as he watched Janice's name popped up on the itinerary. As was his every day, the god of messengers, travelers, thieves and a whole array of other domains found himself piled high with his usual responsibilities and duties. None of his Olympian brothers had ever worked the kind of hours he worked regularly. Apollo, in particular, as much as he loved his best friend and older brother, was going through his lazy season. The god of the sun worked little during the winter season, hence why the days were short and the nights long, much to the ire of his twin sister. The sun god spent his time slacking off when he should have been fulfilling his godly duties and wooing beautiful mortals and bringing them to his bed. We just left New Rome an hour ago. What's his Janus ordering this time? As much as Hermes wanted to do the same, his godly domains were some of the most time-consuming with the world today and left little room for him to enjoy the pleasures that came with modern society. Back in the day, it was his duty to watch over the travelers and merchants as they went on their long and arduous journeys across Greece and deliver the messages from the sky to the sea, and the underworld. As one of the few gods who had permission to cross into the domains of his father and his uncles, it made his position on Olympus all the more important. These days, his domains that humanity fell under became so varied thanks to society adapting and growing as a whole, that he became the busiest Olympian out of his whole family. One positive though was that out of all the gods, Hermes felt he was the one who had the best understanding of mortals, thanks to all the time he spent mingling with them. The only ones that came close were Athena and Artemis. With today's developments, his immortal family was keeping him busier than ever. Athena and Aphrodite even had the gall to have him deliver their demigods to their mortal parents moments after their birth. You'd think that was something that needed a face-to-face conversation, but apparently, he was wrong. On the rare occasion when he didn't have to work, he often found himself stealing a page out of Apollo's book, spending the night with a woman. There was honestly no better stress relief than a good old-fashioned rumble and tumble in the bedroom, which often led to the birth of his demigod children. Speaking of his demigod children, Hermes felt a flicker of his essence pulsate a few days back somewhere out in California. It was a feeling he'd felt many times before when his demigod children were born. It turned out, a young woman that he spent the night with during the spring of last year had given birth to his latest son. If it wasn't for his hectic schedule, and the laws Olympus followed, he would visit his children as often as he could. As it was, the best he could do was watch over them, and their mothers from afar and offer them aid when he could. Eyeing up the two snakes that wrapped themselves around his famous caduceus, the two let out a low hiss as they looked over the list of deliveries he kept on the monitor at all times. Looks like he ordered season 3 and 4 of CSI.
Crime scene investigation on DVD. What? He could have just snapped his fingers and made them appear if he wanted them so bad. Throwing his hands in the air, the son of Zeus glared at the monitor. I swear to Hades, that damn border god is doing this on purpose. Just order from Amazon, not me. We got another order coming in, this time from Dionysus. Hermes rolled his eyes. No, no, no. I know what that drunk is trying to get a hold of. He leaned forward and deleted the incoming order with a click of his fingers. Grabbing his notepad, he wrote down a short message for the god of wine, before clicking his fingers and sending it off to the wine god's residence at Camp Halfblood. Ever since Dionysus made the mistake of chasing after a nymph that Zeus declared off limits, he'd been forced to remain sober and not touch any source of wine for 100 years, as well as run Camp Half-Blood. His punishment made his younger brother miserable. If he thinks I'm falling for his tricks, then think again. He forgets I'm the god of thieves. His brother would be angry, but he could handle Dionysus. Falling back against his seat, Hermes rubbed his eyes and couldn't stop the yawn from escaping his mouth. Gods, he was tired. The rest of his family didn't know how good they had it. I need coffee, otherwise, I'm not going to make it. Stretching out his hand, a mug reading World's Best Grandma, a recent present from Apollo appeared, coffee filled to the top inside. Giving it a quick sniff, he brought it up to his lips and instantly regretted it. Rolling down the window, Hermes spat the coffee out onto the street, followed soon after by the rest of the mug. As a god, he could make almost anything appear if he willed it so. All he had to do was picture it in his mind, and will it to be. However, with food and drinks and other edible delicacies, said god had to have some skill over the art. He wasn't bad by any means and was known to treat his mortal lovers to a home-cooked meal from time to time, which made the food he conjured pretty good. His Aunt Hestia and even his stepmother had given him their stamp of approval. Yet, for some reason unbeknownst to him, Hermes could never make a decent cup of coffee. This was the most ridiculous thing. No matter how hard he tried, the Olympian could not crack the code after years of practicing. It was such a mundane thing, yet he failed miserably at it. If Apollo, Ares, or any of his brothers found out, they wouldn't let him live it down. Feeling someone tapping his leg, Hermes glanced over at George and Martha, the latter of whom was trying to get his attention. What? We can afford to take a short break. Why not make a stop and get refreshments? Oh, and where do you suggest? He watched as the two snakes turned to look at each other, whisper something to one another, before turning back to look at him. How about that place up the street? Hermes blinked. Place up the street. He leaned forward and squinted his eyes. It took him a moment to realize what George and Martha were trying to point out. Up the road, not even a minute walk, he spotted a light on in one of the nearby windows. Despite Apollo not yet flying his chariot through the sky, street lights were enough to show off the orange frame that wrapped around the front of the store. The Fox's Den, he read, before tapping his chin. Why does that sound familiar? It's the cafe Aphrodite mentioned a fortnight ago at Apollo's poker night, George hissed as realization lit up his face. Oh, that's right, how could he forget? It was all Aphrodite went on about all night. After a while, Hermes, along with everyone else, had tuned out the love goddess, but some of what she said had filtered in. All he remembered her saying was that some hunky mortal made one of the most delicious strawberry milkshakes and desserts she'd ever tasted, and that it was so good that Olympus's most beautiful goddess rewarded the mortal with a big smooch in the middle of his establishment. It was so good that she dared to say it might be as good as the delicacies Aunt Hestia and Aunt Hera were known to create. If he remembered right, even Athena and Artemis enjoyed it. If his two elder sisters enjoyed something created by a male mortal, then he must have been good. They were notoriously picky and hard to please. Grinning, Hermes didn't hear what George and Martha said next. Before waving his hand and turning his caduceus to its phone form, the Olympian god was already on his feet, closing his truck door shut with newfound energy as he marched over to the Fox's Den. Well, let's go and see what the fuss is about. Present leaving the counter, the blonde owner of the Fox's Den walked closer to the door, gazing curiously at the man of the other side. Hey, I'm not open yet, and I won't be open for a couple of hours. He pointed to the clock behind on the wall behind the counter. Come back later, and I'll be happy to take your order. What hope he had that the guy would take his word and leave was proven false when the guy didn't move. AWW, come on, can't you make an exception this once? Hermes put his hands together in a prayer motion. I've been up for hours. I need a little pick-me-up, that's all. Rolling his eyes and feeling a headache coming on, Naruto took another step closer to the door. It was too early for this. Look, I haven't got much ready. I just walked through the door a minute ago myself. Why don't you go to Starbucks or something? I'm sure one of those is open 24/7. In response, Hermes made a face and stuck his tongue. No way. I hate all that franchise crap. They stopped making good coffee years ago, and I hear you make a hell of a drink. I have it from a reliable source that you're one of the best in the city. Oh, who's this reliable source? One of his regular customers maybe? He wondered if one of those food critics stopped by. He thought he saw one stop by a week ago, taking notes on a little notepad and looking very up themselves. Every order sent his way, and Naruto put a little bit of extra care into, resulting in the guy leaving with the biggest smile on his face. It was a good feeling watching his customers leave with big smiles on their faces. Hoping to get an answer, the blonde received a wagging finger in return instead. That would be telling. I could never give up my reliable sources, but no, they had nothing but glowing reviews about this place you have. Frowning, Naruto was about to speak, before he got cut off. You're here, and the machines are on. He pointed to the coffee machine behind the blonde and pointed to the coffee that was in Naruto's hands. Come on, help a fella out. Scratching the back of his head, Naruto looked to and from the mailman and his machines, before letting out a reluctant sigh. Taking a deep breath, he ignored the dark-haired man making a fist in the air, and unlocked the door. No funny business, got it? Giving the man a stern look, he watched as the mailman threw his hands up in the air. Don't worry, I come in peace and all that good stuff. Cross my heart. He made a little motion with his hands over his chest. I'll be gone before you know it, right? Rubbing his eyes and looking at the man suspiciously, Naruto gave a short nod and led Hermes to the counter. His gut was telling him this guy was trouble. Something about the guy screamed prankster. He would know, being one himself. Handing Hermes a menu, the blonde leaned against the counter as he unwrapped his paper cups from their box and picked one out for use. Take a look, and tell me what takes your fancy. I'll let you know if it's currently available or not. You got it. Naruto made a motion, and poked his head through the door leading to the kitchen, giving his clones a subtle sign not to come out. He didn't need a mailman catching his clones at work, nor did he want to explain why there were dozens of himself. Nice place you have here, thanks, the blonde replied. How long have you been open? Not long, the blonde admitted, about 2 months. I opened up before the Christmas period started. Kept me busy and gave this place the boost it needed, but it got crazy busy and hectic some days. I sometimes wondered if I made a mistake. Hermes nodded. I bet. Christmas is always the worst when you're in our line of work, delivering goods to the people of the world in whatever form that takes. Glancing across the menu, Hermes whistled, an appraising and dubious look on his face. Wow. Aphrodite wasn't kidding when she said this menu was varied. There's something of everything in here. The Olympian would admit he wasn't one to visit cafes often. They were more his sister's kind of thing or his aunt's. Like his brothers, he preferred bars or nightclubs, since he picked up most of his hookup from them, though he enjoyed an occasional beer or two to go with the night. I need something to keep me awake for the rest of the day. Not knowing much apart from the standard caffeine-based beverages, Hermes eyed the drink in Naruto's hand. What do you have? Oh, this. Naruto took a small swig of his drink. It's a Spanish latte. Curiosity piquing, Hermes leaned on the tabletop. Is it any different from a regular latte? To answer his question, he received a waved hand in the middle of the air. It's more of an espresso-based drink with texture milk and condensed milk. It's sweeter than a latte, but not as much as a latte with flavored syrup, though I don't use sugar in my drink, and instead, use honey. Hermes nodded his head and liked the sound of everything he just heard. I'll take one of those. He especially liked the espresso part. That would do the trick in keeping him awake. Sure. Do you want food to take with you? Hermes scratched the back of his head, looking indecisive. If you can't decide, I've got some lemon squares left over from the day before. They won't be fresh, but they'll still taste good. I can have them bagged up for you, free of charge since I made them the other day. The god's eyes lit up, and a bright expression washed over his face. That would be great. Thanks, no problem. Take a seat, and I'll bring them over. Watching as the blonde owner turned around and prepared his drink, Hermes spun around and headed for the closest table. Maybe this place was alright after all, and everything Aphrodite was spouting on about wasn't just hot air. The mortal appeared decent enough. After all, who would give away lemon squares for free? No one he'd ever met, that's for sure. Not to mention, if he could win over his male-hating sister, then the guy must be doing something right. Though, watching as the mortal went to work, he understood why Aphrodite kept mentioning the handsome owner. If he'd won over the goddess of love, then Hermes could count down the days she inevitably invited him into her bed. Her two biggest weaknesses after all were chocolates and handsome mortals. This guy represented both, which meant he was as good as hers, and he didn't even know it. Though it could be hard with Athena and Artemis around, both seemed equally as interested in the mortal, though for different reasons. As far as Hermes was concerned, he was staying out of any trouble those three might create. He thought back to the love goddess. Then again, she does like a challenge, he thought, leaning on the table and resting his head against his arms. I wonder if I should start a betting pool. 100 drachmas maybe. He would have to look into this some more when he wasn't feeling as tired. Sighing and rubbing his face as he waited for his order, Hermes shut his eyes and let his body relax. It was only for a minute. His schedule was getting busier by the minute, and spent all last night going from state to state. He earned this much, granted, gods didn't need as much sleep as mortals did, and could theoretically remain awake for greater lengths of times, sometimes days and possibly even weeks depending on the god. However, he was reaching his limit. He just needed a moment to relax. After a few minutes passed, Naruto finished the drink, capping the top with a plastic lid and adding a paper sleeve to the takeaway cup. "Alright, that's your drink. Give me a moment, and I'll bag up those lemon squares I promised. You alive back there?" ZZZZZZZZZZZZ. Stopping mid-step, Naruto glanced up from the drink, and his jaw dropped when he looked over at the table the mailman sat behind. "You have to be kidding me." The Olympian had his face slumped against his arms, eyes covered by his forearm and mouth hanging wide open, causing loud snores and gargles to come out. A foot twitched against the leg of the chair, and his nose wrinkled. The blonde couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was this guy serious? He wasn't running a bed and breakfast. Marching over, Naruto initially gave Hermes a subtle shake to jolt him into consciousness. He whispered for him to wake up, but Hermes merely turned his head. When that failed, he shook him harder, adding some extra force into the shakes. When that also failed, he started throttling the guy, shaking him like a rag doll. "Wake up! Damn it." Despite Naruto practically throwing the guy around back and forth in his seat, the guy wouldn't wake up as he slumped back down on the table. The guy must have been the heaviest sleeper he'd ever seen. How heavy of a sleeper is he? This is ridiculous. He contemplated driving his fist into the back of his skull, reminiscent of Sakura waking him up during their Team 7 days, though he decided against it. It's not like this guy can't take the hit, he thought, standing back up and narrowing his eyes at the sleeping Olympian. "I wasn't sure at first, but his energy matches those 3 women. He hides it well, and you'd think he was just an ordinary mailman. But he isn't. He acted normally around those women for the simple reason that they gave him no reason to be on guard with them." The blonde shinobi didn't say anything, staring at Hermes as the man's face twitched in his sleep. A smirk grew on his face and started cracking his neck and knuckles. If the guy wanted to fall asleep and leave himself open in such a manner, then that was his business. He was the one who knocked on his door before he was open. He'd been lenient, and let the guy in, but now the mailman had the guts to fall asleep as he was about to send him off with free lemon squares. This guy didn't know he was in the presence of Konoha's prankster king. Deep down in his heart, Naruto was still a prankster and always would be. Seeing a prime opportunity in front of him, he couldn't resist. It got him thinking, when was the last time he pulled a prank on someone? Surely it wasn't as long as he was picturing. Over a decade maybe. Either way, he needed to shake the rust from his mind. He wasn't sure how long he had, but he wasn't going to let this chance slip his grasp. "Buddy, you don't understand what kind of a mistake you've made." 20 minutes later, Naruto stifled a laugh as he looked at his handiwork. With more time, he could have created something more elaborate, but sadly he had to make use of his more childish side. Gods, he felt like a teenager from the modern world, laughing at something so mundane and perfectly natural. Teenagers found the silliest of things funny these days, but once again humor was one of the many things that changed over the years. It was all sex jokes and penis reverences these days. Oh well, at least, this will teach him. Creating one more clone, he watched as the clone moved behind the sleeping god, crouched down and extended his index and middle finger until they were inches away from Hermes's derriere. A subtle nod from the original made the clone whisper, "Lightning release." 2-finger jolt. The result was instant. 1 second, Hermes was peacefully sleeping away with his head in his arms, and the next, he was 5 feet in the air, his eyes wide as his hands fell to his bottom as a sharp pain radiated from his left cheek. The clone quickly disappeared as Hermes landed on his feet. "Hey, you're awake," Hermes heard, turning around and facing the counter, where the original Naruto was waiting with a drink in one hand and a paper bag in the other. "You were really out of it. I tried to wake you, but you're one of the heaviest sleepers I've ever seen. I wondered if you died for a moment." "Wah, I fell asleep." The god rubbed his eyes, blinking the sleep out of them. When his eyes landed on the clock behind the counter, he went as pale as a ghost. Wait a minute. How long have I been asleep?" "About 20 minutes, maybe 25. "Oh, no. Hermes ran a hand through his hair while the other grabbed his phone out of his pocket. He scrolled through his delivery list and felt his earlier stress return with a vengeance. There were half a dozen more orders, and they were all over the world. This was going to take him all morning and into the afternoon. "I'm so screwed." As he headed for the door in a half jog, a cough caught his attention. Naruto stood looking at him with a knowing look, shaking the paper cup and bag at him. "Aren't you forgetting something?" "Oh right." Running back and taking his order, Hermes placed some mortal money on the table for the drink before bolting and throwing the door open. "Thanks again." As sudden as he appeared, the god of messengers disappeared. As soon as the door shut behind him, the blonde ninja's calm facade broke and started to chuckle to himself. "I wonder how long it will take for him to notice," he thought. On his own once more, he clapped his hands together. "All right, let's get this place ready." Olympus okay, something funny is going on here, Hermes thought as he walked the cobbled streets of Mount Olympus. Frowning, he watched as another pair of nymphs often found grazing around the foothills of Olympus sauntered off, erupting into a fit of giggles and hushed tones when they saw him. One by one as the incidents grew, his paranoia started doing the same. Everyone he came across resulted in the same issue arising. It had been like that all day, and Hermes was beginning to think he was amiss on some kind joke floating around his immortal family. Every delivery stop since this morning, no matter who it was, would either start with them laughing at him or forcing themselves to look away as he handed them their delivery. Even George and Martha, whenever he was inside his chariot truck, would look away from him. He could have sworn he heard them laughing underneath their hisses. Truth be told, he cared little about his companions. After his Spanish latte, he could still taste the delicious remnants of his drink on his lips. The Olympian almost crashed his chariot truck when he brought it up to his mouth for the first. Not to mention, the lemon squares were heavenly that his eyes nearly rolled into the back of his head. Oh, he understood the appeal after his cup was empty and his bag of lemon squares became substantially lighter. It was damn good. No, it was better than good. It was amazing. It was no wonder his sisters and the love goddess were taken with the little cafe the way they were. He would be going back in the future, and this time at a reasonable time. It could be a good place to pick up beautiful women too. Desiring nothing more than the rest he deservedly earned, he headed in the direction of his temple, located on the eastern side of Olympus. As he closed in on his home, Hermes spied a cloaked figure coming from the opposite direction. His smile grew as the scent of toasted marshmallows and wood smoke danced around his nose and grew stronger the closer the figure got. There was only one person on Olympus who carried that delicious scent. Aunt Hestia, the eldest of the gods and the firstborn child of Kronos and Rhea, was as every bit as beautiful as her two younger sisters, carrying the sweet demeanor that earned her the love and respect from every resident on Olympus. Truthfully, she was desired by many on Olympus, and history had shown the suitors that offered themselves to her beauty. However, all were turned away, as Hestia remained true to her vow. Woe to any man who dared force themselves upon the goddess of the hearth, and would find themselves sent into the eternal darkness within Tartarus. Hello, her voice broke halfway through his name, her eyes marginally widening. Oh dear, Hermes, dear. His aunt's face softened, though a hint of annoyance laced her voice. Have you been spending time with Ares again, or did you run into Nio? He shook his head. Not recently, I just got home from deliveries. He hadn't seen Ares all week. The god of war had disappeared off into the mortal world with Aphrodite again, likely on one of their so-called getaways, and the pair likely wouldn't be back for another week or so. Nio, on the other hand, hadn't been seen in years. His wayward older sister didn't visit much, primarily due to the estrangement between her and her parents. I see. Hermes watched as a mirror was conjured in his aunt's hand. Have you looked in the mirror recently? Shaking his head, his aunt held the mirror up to his face, and Hermes couldn't stop his jaw from dropping. What the hell? A chopped gasp erupted from his body and caught himself leaning closer to the mirror, his hand reaching up and touching his forehead. Aunt Hestia? Yes, Hermes, why is there a penis drawn on my face? His aunt's smile never faltered. I don't know, Hermes. I was hoping you would fill me in. I'm equally as confused as you are. Hermes got a sense his good-natured aunt was trying her best not to laugh at his current predicament. The way the edges of her mouth twitched and the way her idle hand tugged at the hems of her sleeves were a telltale sign. It wasn't hard for the Olympian to determine who defaced his face. There was only one moment in the day where he could say he was unaware of his surroundings. How had he not noticed? It was over 12 hours later. He'd been walking around with a penis drawn on his face the whole day. It was no wonder people couldn't keep a straight face when they saw him. Even Hestia looked ready to bust a gut in hysterics. That asshole barista did this to me. The image of Naruto appeared in his mind, and Hermes couldn't stop his eyes from blazing with godly energy. No wonder he seemed in such a good mood when he woke up. His aunt's eyebrows raised. Barista, he threw his hands in the air. The one Aphrodite keeps talking about. He stomped away, snapping his fingers and making the ink-drawn penis disappear from his forehead. If he thinks he got one over on me, then he's got another thing coming. Doesn't he know who I am? Rubbing his hands like a Disney villain, a devious glint appeared in his eyes. Oh, the payback that's coming his way will be legendary. I practically invented mischief and pranks. The smile never faltered from Hestia. I'm sure, dear. Though I'm sure he meant no harm, so please go easy on the mortal. Nothing life-threatening, please, she asked, with an edge of authority laced in her words. Granted, the mortal had been rather ballsy to do such a thing to her immortal nephew, but he didn't deserve to die over it. Thankfully, Hermes was one of the more laid-back gods on Olympus. If such a thing happened to Ares, or gods forbid Zeus, then she doubted the mortal would last another second. He'd be reduced to ash before he could blink. I won't do anything rash, Aunt Hestia. I'm just going to one-up him, that's all. I'm not that petty. thank you." Hermes watching him walk away, Hestia spied the clothes on his back, before letting out a giggle as she covered her mouth. It appeared the face sketch had not been the only gift Hermes received. On the back of Hermes' mailman uniform, the barista also added some extra patchwork to his mailman uniform. In this case, in bright orange letters, the words, "Juicy," in all capitals, were sewn across his back, with an arrow pointing down to Hugh Nephew's posterior. "I wonder how long it will be before he notices," Hestia muttered to herself, watching her nephew march away before continuing down the path, the odd giggle escaping her lips throughout the rest of her day.
"Okay, I've got 3 coffees for the 3 of you," Naruto spoke cheerfully, lowering his tray close to the table as he placed the 3 cups of steaming coffee next to his waiting customers. "I'm sorry for the wait. It's been a little hectic in here this past hour." "That's okay. We don't mind," the woman in the middle said, her dark brown eyes flickering between Naruto and the 2 other women on either side of her. "It smells heavenly, doesn't it, girls?" "Absolutely, it was worth the wait." His smile widened a fraction, and bowed his head to them. "You're very kind." If he had to guess, the 3 young women sat around the table appeared to be sisters, possessing long dark hair and elfin-like features that only served to enhance their appearance. They attracted some attention from the other patrons, though they didn't appear to notice. Though the winter was reaching its end and its chill lingered in the air, all 3 were wearing dress tops that left their arms bare. Each was comprised of different shades of white, making Naruto shiver looking at them. He guessed some people didn't get affected by the cold as others did. He wished he was that lucky. Moments before the 3 women came inside, the current of the wind strengthened for the briefest of moments. It was enough for the regular citizens of New York not to make heads or tails of it, but it was enough for him to take notice. Years of training on Mount Myaboku had sharpened his senses to an extreme level, to the point where he could sense nature chakra and related energy sources without the need to activate Sage mode. The women, while nowhere near the level of particular individuals that visited the fox's den, he could sense were still stronger than the average human by a sizable amount. Not to mention when they walked into view of the store, he could have sworn their hair and the hems of their dress tops were dancing in the air. Like the others, he saw no reason to keep them away. As long as they didn't start any funny business, then they were welcome any time. "Now, I've got 2 slices of the Russian honey biscuit cake." He lowered the plates down, and felt a bubble of excitement as the 2 women on the left and right made dreamy expressions as they gazed at their orders. Their forks found their way into their hands like magic, and were eagerly digging in before he could lower the 3rd plate onto the table. "And 1 sticky toffee pudding." A similar look arose of the middle woman and saw her mouth silent words to herself. "If you need anything else, you know where to find me." "We certainly will," she muttered, slipping a piece into her mouth and letting out a sigh of pleasure. The 2 next to her erupted into a fit of giggles, with the blonde leaving them to enjoy their orders. Truth be told, as he wandered back to the counter, he'd noticed more and more similar individuals and groups like the 3 women appearing as of late. It had been happening over the last couple of weeks, during sporadic times in the day. He'd felt something off about them all as soon as they appeared close to the den, though he sensed differences with the energy and life force that coursed through their veins. Some were like the women currently in a daze with their cake orders, where the natural energy within them felt air-based. Others that came felt more connected to the earth, more traditional energy, much like when he manipulated senjutsu. In the back of his mind, the energy reminded him of the Zetsu clones created from the first Hokage's cells, though with none of them malevolent intent or evil nature. All he felt was positivity radiating from them, and all had a tinge of green to their skin that only he noticed, though not that he let on. Then there was the small group a few days ago with energy that radiated like the sea, with a distinct smell of the ocean and the beaches lingering on their person. More often than not, they were all beautiful, all possessing the elfin appearances he became accustomed to when greeting and serving them. 90% of the time, they were women, though occasionally, a male or 2 appeared through his doors. It started with an individual, or a pair visiting each day, but soon the fox's den was becoming a hotspot for the elfin beauties. Each day, more and more seemed to be appearing. If he was honest, Naruto never imagined the fox's den would become a hotspot for nymphs of all things. It took him a couple of visits to realize what they were. If he had to put money on it, then the 3 women sat around the table currently must have been air nymphs. If what he felt was any indication, the number of encounters he'd had with nymphs weren't many and were sporadic over the years. Thinking back on it, the last time he saw a nymph was over 300 years ago, somewhere in Europe, Germany if he remembered right, or possibly France. With a moment of peace and everyone inside happy with their orders, the blonde grabbed a spare tray and started moving around the tables, collecting up the finished plates and cups. Thanks to the first 3 months being a success, Naruto chose to make a few changes in the kitchen, namely to make the working hours for his clones a little easier. His clones had been a godsend, and if not for them, his menu for the den would have been a fraction of what he offered, especially when it came to the cakes and desserts. So, he installed a commercial dishwasher and glasswasher, instead of cleaning them all by hand by the sinks.
So far, it had made a world of difference. It was always funny to see how the smallest of things could make all the difference in the workplace. He was halfway around the room making his rounds, his tray stacked high with plates and cups, when he found himself freezing in place. His eyes flickered up to the entrance of the den, hovering over the door. Slowly, he journeyed back to the front after dropping the tray off in the kitchen, handing it off to a clone who looked at him with a serious expression. Every clone behind him had stopped, each wearing a similar look on their faces. They felt it too. It was another energy signature. However, this one was vastly different from the nymphs that occupied his tables. He didn't sense any attachment to the air, or the earth, or the sea. It was darker in nature and made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. In short, the energy felt like death. Looking across the room, the trio of nymphs had sensed the oncoming power as well, if the way their bodies stiffened. Their eyes were wide as dinner plates, expressions stuck in a mask of fear and terror. No one else in the room appeared to be affected, though he had no time to determine how or why when the bell over the doorway jingled. A waft of cold air entering the room as a body walked inside. The person in question was male, standing around the same height as himself with skin the color of teakwood. His eyes were a haunting shade of gold, like the honey he offered to his customers with their tea and coffee. Long black hair flowed past his shoulders, like a curtain of shadows that covered part of his regal and king-like face. He was dressed immaculately, wearing a suit that made the Hollywood stars from the TV look inadequate in comparison. Across the room, as he made his way towards the counter, some of his female customers took notice. If the blushes appearing on their faces were any indication, they found the man very attractive. When he got to the counter, Naruto noticed the man looking around the room, not giving anything away with his expressionless face. The man made him feel a little on edge, though outwardly he didn't show it. Anyone that gave off a sense of death needed to be closely watched, especially around so many civilians, who were none the wiser. He looked at the three nymphs out of the corner of his eye, though noticed the man briefly look their way as well. All three visibly gulped, and to Naruto's surprise, gave the man a short curtsy, despite being sat down. Just who is this guy, he thought before putting on a smile. Welcome to the Fox's Den, Naruto welcomed, ending the silence and catching the man's attention. As he did with every customer, he took out a menu and offered it to the finely dressed man. However, unlike everyone else that walked through his doors, the man didn't take the menu. Instead, he stared at Naruto, then looked in the glass cabinet where many of the den's cakes were presented to the public, and then back at the blonde. Are you the owner of this establishment? His voice was rich and velvety. It was so smooth the blonde could picture the voice belonging in a blues club, making the women swoon and sway with his velvety tunes. I am. Is there something I can help you with? The man nodded, lacing his fingers together and placing them on top of the counter. You can. My name is Mr. Black. I'm here representing a client, if you will, who wishes to privately book your establishment out for an afternoon. Naruto's eyebrows raised in surprise. This was a first. Really, truthfully, he hadn't looked into the idea of customers privately renting the space out for an afternoon, or an evening. Really, the man nodded, his face remaining impassive as honey gold met blue. My client has caught wind of your establishment and heard the glowing reviews from members of her family that have already visited. Her interest has piqued because of it, and she wishes to visit you to see if the word of mouth is true. The blonde nodded, though he adopted a confused look. Well, that's great and all, but why does she need to rent out the entire place? Can't she visit during my regular days? The list when we're open is displayed on the window on the right as you enter. Unfortunately not, due to certain time constraints. The man known as Mr. Black answered back immediately as if expecting the question. My client is a busy woman, who has important duties and responsibilities that she must see to. Around these months in particular, the man shifted his stance, reaching into his pocket and pulled a check. Her current place of work can be rather time-consuming. Rubbing the back of his head, Naruto guessed he could understand the reasoning, though renting it out for one person seemed a bit much. Who was this person anyway? Some kind of CEO of some big-time corporation, or maybe some visiting princess, or queen. He was sure he didn't have any royalty visit his little cafe yet, at least, none that he knew of anyway. Not to mention, if this guy who sensed like death was working for someone, did that mean the woman he was referring to also carried around the same kind of feeling? Humming to himself, and tapping his fingers against the counter, Mr. Black patiently waited for Naruto to speak. So, it's one person renting the place out. Am I getting that right? I'll be catering to one person if I accept. Two. Her husband will be coming with her. The blonde sighed as the picture forming in his mind became clearer. Okay, I guess that makes sense. They want a private space to enjoy their meal. That's correct. Motioning for his visitor to wait one moment, the blonde disappeared into the back room. Before long he returned, this time with a red book in his hands. revealed to be a business diary. It shouldn't be too much of an issue, so long as they give me some time to warn my other customers. This is the first time I've done something like this since I opened. Taking out a pen from beneath the counter, he held it ready in his hand. Did your client have a date in mind? She did. She would like the 14th of February, the 14th. Oh, Naruto started, beginning to flick through the pages before stopping a moment later. He gave the man a deadpan stare. The 14th of February, that's right. So, Valentine's Day, once again, that is correct. Putting down his pen, Naruto gave the so-called Mr. Black a skeptical look. This guy couldn't be serious, could he? Let me get this straight. Your client wants to privately book out my cafe for an afternoon on Valentine's Day of all days, one of the potentially busiest days of the year for someone like me, which also happens to be tomorrow. The blonde shinobi felt like wringing the guy's neck when he nodded. That's right, hence why I was given this. He held up the hand with the check still resting in his grasp and placed it down on the counter. My client is the understanding kind, and to compensate you for your time and willingness to accept under short notice, I was permitted to offer you a blank check. Naruto blinked in surprise and tilted his head when he stared down at the check. True to Mr. Black's words, the part of the check that displayed the amount of money was blank of any writing, while a very neatly written signature was present in the bottom corner. Your client is serious about this? Hush, she is. She is a lady of taste and is not the type who visits the average establishment. For her to come to your business and bring her husband with her is a great honor. The blonde noticed the way the smartly dressed man enforced the last part of his sentence. So, I can write any amount on here? The man nodded. So he further asked, I could write down something like $1 million and that wouldn't be an issue. Watching Mr. Black closely, the man pushed a lock of stray hair out of his face, his gold eyes boring into his own with something akin to amusement. Uzumaki, Naruto nodded, and let the man continue. All I will say is that money is of no issue to my clients. Name your price, and I shall inform my client you will be expecting them tomorrow without delay. The blonde shinobi couldn't help but whistle, both in amazement and amusement. Whoever they were, they must have pockets that ran deep into the earth if they could throw around words like that. Rubbing his chin as he let the information sink in, he ignored Mr. Black's expressionless stare as the man waited for a response. The blonde shinobi of old wasn't worried when it came to money, not in the slightest. Over the years of his existence, Naruto had done the smart thing and kept a little nest egg to the side that over time began to grow and grow. It was the side effects of becoming a responsible adult. When his decision to come to New York and set up shop was decided, he dipped into that nest egg and got everything he would need with it. His home, the fox's den, all the appliances and furniture, not to mention all his ingredients. If he was honest, when everything was added up, it hadn't broken the tip of the iceberg of the fortune he was sitting on. He rarely touched it and had it all hidden away in a location only he was aware of. Everything he made from the fox's den went into a bank account he set up before arriving. He couldn't look too suspicious. Then again, I am running a business and that's a whole afternoon of revenue not coming my way. $1 million is too much, even if their pockets are too deep to make sense of. He didn't want to appear too greedy, but if they were offering a chance to fill his wallet then why not? He wouldn't go too overboard. $10,000 and you have yourself a deal, seemed like a fair ask. Hiding his surprise, he watched as Mr. Black didn't bat an eyelash and pulled out a fancy-looking Mont Blanc fountain pen from his inside pocket. Is that made of real gold? How fancy are these people? Scribbling the amount on the check, Mr. Black looked him dead in the eye, the check being offered to the blonde barista. Taking it and giving it a once-over, Naruto smirked at Mr. Black. I hope this doesn't bounce. That would be embarrassing after everything the man just told him. Mr. Black didn't react. He remained completely stone-faced as he replied, Trust me, Mr. Uzumaki, it won't if you say so. Glancing at the name written on the check, he rose an eyebrow. Mrs. P. Underhill. Might I inquire what her first name is? I like to know the names of the people whose money I'm taking. Rolling his neck, a distinct pop made the mysterious Mr. Black sigh in comfort before answering, You'll get your answers tomorrow. Until then, all you need to know is that my clients will arrive tomorrow at 4 p.m. How long they will stay for, I don't know. However, I recommend that you prepare thoroughly. Mrs. Underhill is known to be demanding if the gossip she's heard about your food is anything to go by. He leaned in, with Naruto reacting by doing the same. She has a sweet tooth that puts many to shame, though can be picky. She has high expectations, is that right? Naruto rubbed his chin, a thoughtful expression sweeping over him. If she had high expectations, then he would need to pull a few rabbits out of his hat. As confident as he was that his menu would knock their socks off, he could prepare some specials dishes for his guests. If they were willing to part with $10,000, then he was going to give them their money's worth. A couple of ideas were floating around. He could have a lot of fun with this. He had a few dishes in the pipeline he could test out tomorrow. Are there any dietary restrictions I should know about? None. Any preferences I should know about? Again, Mr. Black shook his head. Well, that made things easy. All right then, in that case, you have yourself a deal. The blonde extended his hand to the man. Tell Mr. and Mrs. Underhill I'll have some specials whipped up just for them. I'll make sure they get their money's worth. It took a few moments of silence before Mr. Black reciprocated. The man had a firm handshake, and Naruto couldn't help noticing how cold the man's hands were. They felt like ice cubes. I'll pass on the message. Nodding, the blonde pocketed the check. Before the man left, he spoke up again. Can I get you anything before you go? Mr. Black was prepared to turn around and leave at a moment's notice, but he couldn't deny the smell radiating from the fox's den was heavenly. He looked across the room, ignoring the shivering forms of the nymphs, and looks at what some of the mortals were eating and drinking. He hadn't visited a cafe in the mortal world in decades. His eyes flickered to the cabinet with the cakes, zeroing in on the chocolate cake to the far left. His tongue licked the edge of his mouth. That looks good. Straightening his tie, his voice was low, almost a whisper. I'll take a slice of the chocolate cake to go, and a regular coffee with no sugar, coming right up. Valentine's Day, my dear, you can't be serious, Hades muttered, his voice low as his dark eyes took in the orange frame that wrapped around the front of the building. He'd never seen something so hideous and deliberate in centuries. It was like a monstrous beacon of color, and far too bright for his rich taste, being in an environment where the brightest colors were the glowing crimsons and dark yellows that emanated from the rivers of lava that ran through the underworld. He could say that if he ever found something that sickly shade of orange anywhere near his home, he would send it deep into Tartarus. It would never see the light of day again if he had his way. Who in their right mind would paint the front of their business orange? Standing on his left, his wife of nearly 5,000 years stood in all her outstanding beauty and glory, an array of shopping bags of all shapes and sizes in her grasp. Persephone was as beautiful as the day he first laid eyes on her, more so than that pesky love goddess in his opinion. The shining flower of the underworld, her very presence brought out a side of the eldest son of Kronos that few would get to see. When it was time to separate and her time came to return to Olympus, it was like the joy and happiness she brought with her would evaporate, leaving nothing but his dark thoughts and the ever-present wails of those within the fields of punishment. He felt his wife lean into him, the top of her head barely coming up to his shoulder. Even wearing those ludicrous heeled boots she chose to wear on their outings into the mortal world, he towered over her as he did with most people. He didn't show it, but he was disappointed she wasn't wearing the black dress she frequently wore whilst in the underworld, the one that billowed around her body like smoke, and gave off an aura of mystery. Millennia on from the day they married, and his wife was still capable of making his godly itcher boil with desire. Don't be a bore, Hades. There's nothing wrong with adding a splash of color to an otherwise dull palette. A snort came out of Hades. Persephone, a splash of color is painting a window frame red, or a letterbox a shade of blue. A splash of color is not painting the outside of the building the most hideous shade of orange imaginable. Be that as it may, I like it. You would like it. Are you doubting my tastes? Never, my dear. I'm merely showing how different our color preferences are. Dressed in one of his finest suits for their day in the mortal world, the god of the underworld hadn't been able to hide his skepticism when his wife informed him of their plans for Valentine's Day. If the elder god was honest, he didn't see the point in Valentine's Day. It was a silly little mortal holiday that used that dreadful son of Aphrodite and Ares as the mascot. The love goddess was bad enough on the rare occasion that he came into contact with her, but her son was equally as bad. The only difference between them was Aphrodite knew where the line was when it came to her Olympian family. Eros, on the other hand, had a habit of forgetting the line existed, being one of the few gods who could strike genuine fear into the hearts of an Olympian like Zeus, Demeter and Hera, thanks to the powers endowed to him by Aphrodite. Hades always kept one eye open should he discover Eros was nearby and in the neighborhood. Those love-enforced arrows of his could do more harm than good. By some divine miracle, the son of Aphrodite knew better than to pick a fight with him, though he couldn't deny a piece of him wished the little pigeon-winged cherub would give it a try. Oh, the satisfaction he would get from beating that little annoyance into Tartarus would be legendary. Back to the point of Valentine's Day, Hades didn't understand why he needed to show his wife how much he loved her on this one particular day. During the 6 months of the year that Persephone was in his embrace, he tried to show her every day how much he loved her. Granted, there were missteps along the way, and their time together had been a learning experience for both of them. His undeserving black heart did love his queen and wife to Tartarus and back. He didn't need a silly holiday to show it in excess. Well, shall we go in? Persephone asked, her watery gold eyes silently motioning to the front door and unaware of his thoughts. Sighing, the god of the underworld knew there was no getting around it. Very well, Persephone puffed out her cheeks in annoyance. You could try and sound enthusiastic. That was me being enthusiastic. His response only served to get a groan out of his wife. Crossing his arms over his chest, his dark pupils flickered to the corner of his eyes. looking in the direction of the Empire State Building. A heavy scowl marred his face, and one of his hands tightened into a fist. Although the mist shrouded Olympus from the sight of the mortals, Hades could feel its presence lingering over the famous skyscraper. The home of the Greek pantheon has never been a home to him, nor did it welcome him like it did the rest of his family. Being near its doorstep, it never failed to stir up old and bitter feelings. His so-called family were the ones who made him into the person he was, keeping him at a distance at all times and never trusting him the same way after the Titanomachy. His temple should have been on Olympus, just as his brothers and sisters were built on its surface. Hell, Poseidon had one on Olympus and within Atlantis. There was no telling how many that dunderhead, Zeus, had. The point was, he helped build Olympus into what it was, and should have been recognized for that like the rest of them. Why couldn't they have gone to another city? Before Hades could let his thoughts begin running away, the petite and smooth hand of his wife laced through his fingers. The contact was enough to halt those thoughts. Stop thinking about them. I wasn't. He didn't fight her grip as she pried his hand away from his crossed arms. Yes, you were. A pang of sympathy ran through Persephone's chest. The goddess of spring had learned the telltale signs of her husband over the millennia. She knew something was bothering him like a pit in her stomach. I know you don't like being so close to Olympus and it stirs up old feelings and grudges, but we've had a nice day out so far, haven't we? It took a moment, but Hades gave a short nod. Good, I'm glad. Let's not spoil it with ill feelings. His expression softened. It's not that I haven't enjoyed our time today. I have enjoyed it, I promise. He gave her hand a light squeeze, and felt the corners of his mouth twitch up when she smiled at the gesture. I don't see why we couldn't have gone somewhere else. California, Boston, even Miami would have been a welcome change. The essence of my siblings and Zeus's ilk can be sensed all across New York. I'm surprised we haven't run into one of them yet. A sigh escaping her lips, Persephone dropped her bags and laced her arms around her husband's neck. The gesture was enough to feel Hades lean his body into her, embracing in the warmth she provided. Despite the size difference in their appearance, the queen of the underworld proved she was stronger than she looked. Today is all about us, don't make it about them. Hades stayed silent for a couple of moments, letting her words sink in. I know, and I'll try, that's all I ask. Standing on her tiptoes, Persephone laid a gentle kiss on her husband's pale cheek. Put them out of your mind and enjoy this place with me. I've heard great things about it. Even Thanatos told me how much he enjoyed the food here. The crumbs from his chocolate cake were still on the corner of his lips when he came to confirm the reservation. I guess if Thanatos enjoyed it, then it's worth a try, Hades admitted. Like most of the gods and goddess of his ever-expanding godly family, his lieutenant was a picky eater, and like himself, had a rich taste when it came to mortal cuisine. If Thanatos enjoyed what he ate, then it couldn't have been awful, though, he was still skeptical about the kind of man that painted part of a building orange. Led the way, my love, Persephone beamed at Hades, the twitching of his lips strengthening until a small smile graced his often scowling face. Pushing the door open, the sound of the bell rang as they entered. Like their fellow immortals, a wave of warmth shrouded over them, and Hades watched as his wife visibly relaxed, and together they took in the room. The rich smell of coffee laced the air, reminding him of the mornings his wife would wake him up with his favorite blend of coffee. The room was bigger than either of them expected, with tables and chairs pushed to each side, with one singular table with two chairs sat in the middle of the room. You must be the Underhills. Both sets of eyes gazed over to the counter, where the patiently waiting owner was stood. The Underhills, Hades thought, rolling his eyes at the surname Persephone had given them. His wife loved coming up with new aliases for them during matters like this. Walking out from behind the counter, Naruto extended his hand to Hades, a pleasant smile on his face as he greeted the pair of immortals. My name's Naruto Uzumaki, the owner of the Fox's Den. First things first, I would like to thank you for taking an interest in my humble establishment. When your representative came by yesterday, I hardly believed it. I thought he was joking at first, but I can see he was telling the truth. It's nice to meet you both. Shaking his hand, Hades noted the firm grip the blonde gave him and felt his wife step forward and offer her hand. Instead of shaking her hand though, Naruto gently took her hand into his own and placed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. The act was enough for Persephone to widen her smile. She liked a mortal with manners. He's very easy on the eyes too, Persephone thought. A handsome face, and a very nice body if the way his clothes tighten on his body is any indication. She was no Aphrodite, but she could window shop from time to time. You're most welcome, and I'm happy you accepted my offer. I'm sorry for the short notice, but the news doesn't tend to travel to our neck of the woods until much later, though I've heard nothing but good things about this place. If he had told Thanatos no, then Persephone planned on having him wrapped up in the mist and make it happen either way. I'm Penelope Underhill, and this is my husband, Hank Underhill. Persephone promptly ignored the look her husband was giving her. Well, come over and take a seat. Reaching behind the counter, he pulled out two menus and offered them to the pair of gods. Make yourself comfortable, and I'll give you a couple of minutes to look at the menu. He motioned to their table. Also, just so you're aware, I've got some specials of the day prepared for you both. Think of it as my way of ensuring you get your money's worth today. I'll read them out when I take your orders. Thank you, that sounds delightful, Persephone replied, the excitement brimming as she wondered what Naruto had prepared for them. Gently, she pulled her husband to their table, with the god of the underworld glancing at Naruto from the corner of his eyes. Making themselves comfortable and discarding her coat, Persephone eyed her husband. So, what do you think so far? The god of the underworld took notice of the excitement in his wife's voice. She looked at him expectantly, without trying anything on the menu. I can't make any judgment yet. When his wife scowled at him, he internally sighed and made a change to his answer. It appears adequate. The place has a nice atmosphere. The rich smell of coffee is pleasing, I'll admit. As suspected, her face made a 180. I knew you'd like it. The goddess of spring sounded very pleased with herself. There's so much to choose from in here. I'm not sure where to start. The beginning would suffice. A kick to his shin beneath the table forced him to grunt. Don't be sarcastic, my love. It's unbecoming of you. Persephone remained focused on the menu. A content smile plastered on her face. Hades could see her eyes at work, taking in all her options. I wonder what specials he made for us. It's all very intriguing. I find myself curious also, Hades replied. An annoyed expression wormed its way onto his face. Was Hank the best you could think of? It's a nice name. It's a traditional name in the mortal world. The goddess glanced up. Is there something wrong with my choice? Nothing, but I don't see why we can't use our real names, because no self-respecting mortal woman would name their child after the god of the underworld. Name one mortal carrying your name, and we can go home right now. When he didn't speak, Persephone's smile gained a satisfaction to it. I rest my case. Now, less brooding and more choosing. Understood. Remaining silent, Hades opened the menu up and let his dark eyes scan over the contents. He would let Persephone have her fun. His wife did appear excited during their shopping spree earlier in the afternoon. There appears to be something for everything in here, he mumbled, his hand coming up to sweep his oily black hair back. He must go through ingredients like they're going out of fashion if he offers everything he says he does. He must be doing well to afford it. As the richest member of his Olympian family, call him curious if he wondered how a mortal could afford such a massive selection. Most places he was aware of didn't provide a third of what the blonde owner was offering to his clientele. Did he make everything that was listed on the menu? If not, then he must have dozens of suppliers in the pipeline. His cash flow must be a constant wave. He couldn't help with the way he thought. As the god of riches, it sparked his curiosity. Focus, Hades. Pick something before your wife calls you out on it. While Hades was busy mulling over his thoughts, Persephone was busy biting the corners of her mouth. She couldn't decide what she wanted. Everything sounded so good. Where to start? If it wasn't for word getting to her by Hermes, who was delivering a package to Hecate in her residence within the underworld, then she wouldn't have heard a peep about the fox's den. News tended to reach the underworld slower than most, though when she asked why she hadn't heard about such a place existing sooner, she noticed Hermes begin to shuffle around uncomfortably. Surely, any place that attracted the attention of multiple Olympians was worth hearing about. Despite not being an Olympian, being one of the eldest children of Zeus, as well as the queen of the underworld had its perks. Suffice to say, it took 5 minutes before she had Hermes spilling out all the gossip on Olympus. Her time in the underworld had provided her with many a means to get the information out of her unwilling hostage. By the time she let her little brother free, Persephone was internally seething. Cracks formed on the marble floor of her husband's palace as she marched back to her chambers. That damn Aphrodite. Oh, she knew the love goddess could be petty, but she was asking for it now. Aphrodite had done everything in her power to keep the information from getting to the queen of the underworld, and Persephone knew why. Their little rivalry that started with Adonis, all those years ago, continued to plague them to this day and only worsened as time went on. The two goddesses used to be good friends, but these days after the Adonis incident, their relationship never recovered. The two were always trying to one-up each other in a variety of ways, to the point that the other gods would simply bypass them. The stunts they pulled on each other were legendary. However, when one of her mother's servants informed her by iris message that the love goddess planned to visit and spend the evening at the fox's den, with the owner's scrumptious treats, the goddess of spring couldn't help but throw a wrench in her plans. Valentine's Day was a big day for Aphrodite, and Persephone couldn't help but grin at the satisfaction of denying the love goddess of what she desired, even if it was for only one day. She couldn't sense the love goddess's essence anywhere near the fox's den, which meant she hadn't stopped by yet. The look on her face would be priceless. When 5 minutes passed, the two gods felt their host appear next to them, his notebook and pen in hand as he gave them a polite smile. So, before I take your orders, would you like me to read out the specials for you? The blonde looked pleased with himself. Yes, please, Persephone replied. followed by a nod from Hades. She couldn't wait. Well, Naruto started, for this special day, I have arranged 3 different dishes for you, all of which were freshly baked earlier today. The first of which is a grapefruit curd tart with chamomile whipped cream. Persephone's eyes lit up, followed by an audible intake of air. The second is a fig almond tea cake with a coconut honey glaze. Finally, since it's Valentine's Day, I thought the third option should be something related to the subject of love, so I prepared a chocolate-dipped strawberry Neapolitan cake. Hades hummed as he leaned back in his chair. The god of the underworld wouldn't admit it out loud, but the choices laid out to them sounded very appetizing. If the mortal prepared such dishes for them, and if he liked them, he would be willing to leave a generous tip for the man, despite the money already provided. Despite his reputation, Hades commended hard work and dedication. Looking at his wife, Persephone was practically bouncing in her chair, her eyes lit up like fireworks. If the dishes were half as good as the gossip suggested, then Persephone contemplated dragging the man to the underworld and having him set up shop just for her. She had a spot in mind next to her famous garden. That way she and her husband could have their orders brought to them on the veranda overlooking the fields of asphodel. Her fellow goddesses might not be happy with the change in location, and it meant they would have to gain her husband's permission to enter his realm if they wanted to visit. Seeing his wife's excitement, he snapped his menu shut and looked his wife square in the eye. In that case, we'll take all 3. My wife and I will share a plate of each of your specials between us. Naruto nodded and wrote it down on his notepad. His smile widened when he saw Persephone reach over the table and take her husband's free hand into her own. A tiny smile grew on the face of Hades and winked in his wife's direction. It was beautiful to see how in love the pair were with each other. He got the feeling the husband was the type who would go to the moon and back if it made his wife happy. You guys are a sweet couple. That's kind of you to say, Persephone replied, her thumb tracing against her husband's pale skin. He can be as stubborn as a mule when he wants to be, and moodier than a bull seeing red. But deep down my hubby is a softie. Not enough people are lucky enough to see that side of him, but I do. She gave her husband a reassuring squeeze. It hasn't been easy, but we've been married for a long time and overcome obstacles that would cause most to call it quits. I hope he knows how much I have come to love him. The god of the underworld's expression softened further. He does. You're lucky to have each other, Naruto replied, his gaze turning and staring out the window at the people walking the pavement across the road. Most people these days don't seem to understand how precious marriage is, especially when the right person comes along. It provides an opportunity to grow in selflessness as you serve your wife, or husband, and any children that come from the union. It's more than a physical union, it is also a spiritual and emotional union. Both immortals looked at him with mild surprise. They both looked into his blue eyes and noticed a sadness within them. Any kids? Both nodded. A daughter, Hades quietly replied, still looking up at the blonde owner with an inquisitive stare. That's nice. Are you married? The question came from Persephone. Right before her eyes, she noticed a momentary shift happen with the blonde owner, like a door had been cracked open, followed by a wave of sadness briefly resonating from his person, and his face gaining a faraway look as a sad smile took over. Persephone almost wished she hadn't asked, widowed? Oh. Her voice was quiet. I'm sorry. She hadn't intended to stir up old feelings. To be so young and already a widow must have been difficult. He looked barely out of his 20s. It took a few silent moments before the blonde shook off the sadness, his smile returning to normal and waving a hand in the air. Don't be. It was a long time ago. Seeing you both together reminds me of my time with my wife, and how I wish we had longer together. I miss her dearly. He brought his notepad and pen back up. Now, let's keep going with your orders, shall we? What would you both like to drink? Oh, that's right.
The moment the bell rang, Naruto's face lit up as a familiar customer appeared before him. Well, if it isn't my favorite customer. The goddess of the moon blinked in surprise at the blonde's voice. After a long and tiring couple of days training the newest members of her hunt and running them through their first ever monster hunt with little sleep, Artemis decided she needed to slip away for an hour. As always, she left her faithful lieutenant, Zoe, to keep the girls in line until she returned and have the chores completed. The 3 new girls, Lucy, Tracy, and Eloise, showed promise, though it would be many years before they came close to acquiring the skill set her older hunters possessed. Hunters like Zoe, who had been part of the hunt for over 2,000 years, and Phoebe, a daughter of Apollo, who'd joined before even Zoe, were 2 of a handful of young women who grew into elite warriors after spending centuries at her side. Like her aunt Hestia, Artemis often spent the time in a younger form. Most often it was in the form of a girl between the ages of 13 and 15, as many of her young companions tended to fluctuate between those ages. It was a method for her to bond with her hunters, particularly the younger ones who might find her adult form too intimidating and imposing. To make them feel more comfortable, she took on a form that helped them feel at ease. Most of her hunters had come to her to escape from the grasp of evil men and their dark thoughts and desires. which was why her group of maidens were women and women only. Though only a handful of men had ever earned a place in her hunt, it was exceptionally unlikely in this day and age. With some time to herself and Zoe running the hunt in her place, Artemis teleported to New York, changing back into her adult form, and adopting modern clothing rather than her hunting gear. She headed straight for her favorite spot in the city. She sent a message to Athena and asked if her sister wished to join her, but the goddess of wisdom was currently engaged in a meeting with Hephaestus. For once she was going it alone. "Good afternoon, Naruto." "Good afternoon." He handed her a menu and led her to a table near the counter. "It's been a little while since you last visited. I was beginning to wonder if I was ever going to see you again." One of his hands dug into his pockets. "Your sister not with you today. I've been busy of sorts these last few weeks, out of state," she explained. "This is my first time back in the city in over a month." Her most recent hunts had taken her across the North American continent, hunting creatures and monsters big and small with the aid of her hunters. One of the aspects of hunting monsters she always found exhilarating was never knowing how long each hunt was going to take. Some hunts could take no longer than a couple of hours. Once, a hunt back in the 1400s took no longer than 5 minutes. When they discovered the monster they were requested to track and destroy was no more than 300 yards up the dirt path from them. However, other times she participated in hunts that took years to complete. Though time-consuming, the feeling of ending a hunt after such a long period was one of the most gratifying feelings a huntress like herself could have. "And no, my sister was unavailable. Though, I'm sure she will stop by for a visit soon. I see. Not to worry, I'll have to keep an eye out for her." He laughed. "She always has the funniest reactions when she visits. Is it terrible of me to say it brightens my day when I catch her reactions from the corner of my eye?" Artemis couldn't help but half grin at the statement. Truthfully, Athena's reactions during their visits tickled her funny bone as well. The first time with lemon curd still replayed over and over again in her mind, and while shocked the first time, now the Olympian found the scene hilarious. Athena had sworn her to secrecy over that incident, but it didn't mean she couldn't use it to tease the elder goddess. "No, it's not, though I wouldn't mention it to her," she advised, half serious and half in humor. "My sister isn't the type who handles being embarrassed very well."
"I would be careful, and not make your amusement too obvious." "Understood. I'll try and be discreet." He could do that. He was a ninja after all. Discreet was his middle name. "See that you do." Looking around the room, she noticed she was the only customer and forced to frown to etch over her beautiful features. Where was everyone else? She thought business was booming. The last time she was here, she and Athena had been lucky to get a table. If they arrived even a minute later they would have been forced to leave disappointed. "Where's all your customers?" "I thought the business was doing well." The idea that her favorite place wasn't getting the attention it deserved was ludicrous. A chuckle escaped Naruto. "They were all here earlier." Her blank look coerced him to elaborate. "It's Sunday and I close at 2 on Sundays." Remember, the goddess of the moon had let that piece of information slip her mind. "I was moments away from closing up for the day before you came in." Artemis's eyes widened a fraction. "How could I forget?" She looked at the clock behind the counter and read 14:05. In her excitement, the Olympian forgot there was a 3-hour time difference between California and New York. "How foolish of me." She fought the urge to face palm. Her excitement had gotten the better of her and the lack of sleep from the past couple of days was catching up with her. "I'll go. My apologies for," she started to say, already on her feet when the blonde owner waved his hands in the air. Another chuckle escaped him. "Don't worry about it. Sit down." "Sit down? Are you sure?" Artemis hated being needlessly in the way, as rare of an occurrence as it was. "Very." "Now sit and make yourself comfortable," he replied, his voice laced with confidence. If any other male had spoken to her like that then she would have turned his into a jackalope. However, since it was the blonde who she was developing more than a tolerance for, she would allow it. Though he better not push his luck. She sat back down, her menu returning to her hands. "Very well, but only because you insisted." Inwardly, she let out a sigh of relief. She'd been looking forward to this all day. Her sweet tooth was craving for a slice of anything she could get her hands on. The stuff she ate with the hunt was decent, but it never left her fully satisfied, especially her need for sugary baked goods. Her hunters were novices at best when it came to cooking, despite trying in the past to have Hestia give them a few pointers. Smiling, he walked over to the door and switched the open sign to close. He didn't want any more walk-ins. "So what can I get you?" he asked. He didn't bother with his notepad and pen. He already had an idea what the auburn-haired woman was going to order. Vice versa, Artemis looked at him with a blank look, while raising one of her eyebrows. Surely he wasn't serious. "I'll take my usual please. Salted caramel hot chocolate of course. And the cake." "Carrot please." 2 slices. Artemis even held up 2 fingers. His smile grew wider at the cheek. "All right, I'll be with you shortly." He turned and prepared to move away. However, the goddess watched him halt mid-step. A thought crossed his mind that Naruto had been meaning to ask should he encounter her again. "Can I ask you something?" Artemis raised another eyebrow. As long as it's nothing personal, she liked the mortal, but she hoped he knew his boundaries. There was still time to turn him into a four-legged critter. For his sake, he better not ask her on a date as previous foolish men tried. It didn't end well for them. To her surprise, Naruto caught onto her thoughts and shook his head. "It's nothing like that. Cross my heart." He motioned a cross shape over his chest. "It's something I've been wondering and meaning to ask you since your first visit." When Artemis motioned for him to continue, he asked his question. "What's your name?" Artemis blinked in surprise. That wasn't the question she was expecting. "My name." The blonde nodded. "Yeah, your name. I've wanted to ask since you almost cleaned me out of carrot cake on your first visit. You and your sister have become regular faces around here, but I still don't know your name. I'd like to rectify that if you let me." His smile returned, and he gave a light shrug. "You don't have to, but I wouldn't mind knowing the name of my favorite customer," the goddess hummed in thought. She sensed no ill will in his voice, and his posture was calm and relaxed. If he was up to something, he hid it well, though some men were known to have the uncanny ability to hide their true selves behind a mask or facade of a false persona. However, the moon goddess liked to think she was a good judge of character, and thus far the blonde owner had yet to give her a reason to think he was up to no good. He didn't strike her as the type who would possess evil thoughts of that nature. So far, he had proven himself to be a decent man, whose primary concern was keeping his business running and showing kindness and good food to his customers. Leaning back in her chair, she gave a small nod. "I don't see any harm in it. My name is Artemis." Naruto's smile widened, and let out a hum. "Artemis." He repeated the name a couple of times. He liked the way it rolled off the tongue. "That's a beautiful name. You're named after a goddess, you know?" Artemis fought the urge to smirk. Instead, she wore a playful little smile that few male mortals got to see. "I know. Since my family is Greek, they felt it was appropriate for me to have a Greek name. What could be better than being named after a goddess?" "Not much, I guess," he chuckled. "Indeed. Do you know much about Greek mythology?" "It's not a subject people study much these days. It's a rare following." The blonde owner nodded. His hands rested on the chair in front of him. "It just so happens I do. I learned a lot during my time in Greece, as I mentioned the day we met. It wasn't just the language and the food I studied, but the whole mythos that surrounded ancient Greece. I visited a lot of the old sites like you would do in a country with such a rich history." He thought back to the days he traveled around, and thought back to one of his many visits to the old country. "I visited the Acropolis in Athens, the ancient Delphi, Meteora, Epidaurus, ancient Olympia. Those are just a couple of places I had the pleasure of visiting. I can only imagine what they were like back in their day." "Yes, I can imagine," the goddess replied, playing along. He ran a hand through his hair. "You know, I went to what's left of the old temple of Artemis in Turkey a long time ago," he revealed, making Artemis look at him in interest. "I'm not sure what I expected to find, but I couldn't help feeling disappointed when I saw all that was left was foundation and fragments." Looking up at the ceiling, he closed his eyes for a brief moment, remembering his time in Ephesus. "I bet it was a thing of beauty back in the day." "Oh, it was," and Artemis knew full well how majestic her old temple was. Back in ancient times, her temple was frequently visited by women and men of all ages, praying to her for several things that fell under her jurisdiction. The men would pray to her for successful and plentiful hunts, while expecting mothers would pray for strength for the coming days that lay ahead of them. Her temple was one of the most iconic temples ever built on the earth, rivaled only by the Temple of Athena at the summit of the Acropolis and the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. However, twice her temple had to be rebuilt. The first time, a devastating flood reduced it to rubble, courtesy of Poseidon, after one of his infamous temper tantrums. The god of the sea had been forced to pay a great tribute to her as compensation. The second time, a few centuries later, her temple was burned to the ground by that foolish mortal, Herostratus, who sought notoriety and fame. She couldn't lie and say she didn't take a small amount of pleasure in watching the foolish man from getting his just deserts during his execution. Although a modern model was built years later in Istanbul, she had only visited the site once. It didn't possess the same value as the old versions, and a rare handful of people prayed to her these days. While lost in her thoughts, the blonde disappeared behind the counter and got her order underway. "You don't mind if I get things cleaned up after I finish your order, do you?" She shook her head. "Not at all." Fortunately for her, she didn't have to wait long before Artemis found herself sinking into the chair as the taste of her hot chocolate covered her lips. Releasing a small hum of delight, she moved onto her cake, and like always, felt her sweet tooth getting utterly satisfied as her immortal taste buds were showered with sugary bliss. How the mortal man did it, she didn't know, but she wished that she did. Artemis was a decent cook, given some lessons by her mother and Hestia, but had never made anything remotely as sweet and perfect as the meal in front of her. Was there a method to the man's madness? Was there someone helping him? She'd never seen another soul working the little cafe in the time she spent in its warm embrace. She remembered that he mentioned making from scratch many of the delightful goods himself, but when did he find the time to make them all? His menu was vast and unpredictable. It would take him all through the night to make it all. Not to mention, there was the issue of keeping it all fresh. It was a mystery, and part of the moon goddess wanted to solve it. Don't rock the boat, she thought to herself. She had a good thing going here. The fox's den was an escape, somewhere she could get away for an hour or two. She and Athena had been the first to visit, and since then, more and more gods and immortals from their world were beginning to take notice. On the one hand, she wished the little cafe had been her secret with Athena, which only they could enjoy. On the other hand, at least it was getting the business and fame it deserved. If it closed down, Artemis was sure she would weep for days. No more hot chocolate, no more cake. What a dark world that would be. From her seat, Artemis couldn't help but watch him as she sipped her drink. Without Athena to talk with, she had little else to do but watch the man at work. He has good balance, she mused, watching as he stacked one of his trays high with cups and plates and balanced it on the tips of his fingers. For 10 minutes, Artemis sat and watched him moving around the room as if his body was on autopilot. As soon as one task was done, he was on to the next before she could blink. His rate of work is impressive, she mused, before inwardly frowning and rolling her eyes. Stop praising the man. Gods, what is wrong with me? A hand waved in front of her face, and Artemis found the blonde trying to catch her attention. A broom was in his hand, with a small pile of trash piled together next to him. Yes, had he asked her something? She was so lost in her thoughts that she hadn't noticed. Did you need something? Nothing important, but I did want to ask you another question, though, only if you don't mind your attention temporarily leaving your cake. Another question? How bold of him. I'll allow it. However, I expect another round of both. She pointed to her empty plate and cup as she chewed on the final piece of her meal. All in good time, he laughed and took her words in good humor. I asked, what do you do? What do I do? She repeated, a frown appearing at the words. What do you mean? I mean that you said you were out of the state, right? She nodded. Well, was that because of work? If it was, then I was asking, what do you do for a job? What's your profession? Oh, that's what he was asking. Her mouth began to move, yet before any words could come out her mind stepped in. What was she going to say? It wasn't like she going to spill the beans to him and tell him all the glorious details. There's a goddess in front of you, who just so happens to be the actual Artemis we were talking about earlier. Crazy, right? Yeah, no. It was rare for her to inform mortals, especially male mortals, of her true identity. As much as the blonde had grown on her, he still didn't need to know the nitty-gritty details. The only mortals she told were the girls who joined her hunt, demigods she happened to come across, and the few mortals that were clear-sighted and could see through the mist that wrapped around their world. The blonde was neither a woman nor was he a demigod, and Artemis was close to positive that he couldn't see through the mist. Therefore, her identity would remain a secret from him, although maybe telling him he's serving a goddess would earn me a discount, she mused, though shook those thoughts away. She would tuck that question away for another time. I may. She paused for a moment, before settling on a story. Guidance counselor, really? Roll with it, she thought, before continuing. That's right, I specialize in helping young women, typically teenagers and sometimes younger, that come from broken homes or have faced abuse in their past. That part wasn't made up. I have a group of girls that I take away on retreats, working with them out in the wilderness and teaching them how to survive in nature. We go camping, hiking, and I've even shown them how to hunt and gather their food. She heard him whistle, and stare at her with an impressed look. Wow, that's amazing. He grabbed a couple of napkins from the counter and handed them to the waiting hands of the goddess. How many do you work with? About 3 dozen, on your own. All on my own. My sister chips in from time to time, but most of the time it's just me. Her sister often pointed her in the direction of young women that required her aid. Some of Athena's past daughters were once members of the hunt, though none currently existed within the group. Does that surprise you? She watched and gauged his reaction, and felt a stroke of relief when he shook his head. It doesn't, to be honest. I am not surprised at all. She stared at him curiously. Oh, and why is that? His expression turned thoughtful. I'm not sure why, and I can't explain it well, but when I saw you the first time you visited, I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach that you were someone who liked taking care of people. Oh, that surprised her to hear. She leaned forward, inwardly urging him to continue. She wanted to hear more. There's something about you that makes me believe you're someone who has seen bad things happen to people. Maybe you've had bad experiences in the past, or maybe you haven't. That's not my place to ask. He gave her a look, indicating he wasn't going to push that subject with her. Either way, you have this energy about you. It's comforting and warm, and I felt it the first day you walked through that door. He nodded over to the door, and smiled. I think you're someone who wants to shield people, in this case, young girls, and gives them something to strive for. You don't want them to lose themselves down a dark path because of the abuse they've suffered, so you take them into a safe environment and you teach them how to survive. You teach them how to be strong. He leaned on the broom, and his smile widened. I've met a lot of people, and I've met some who have done awful things to others. Going across the world opens up a box that can't ever be closed. Sadly, I've come to realize some people can only be described as awful, misguided and cruel. They inflict pain onto other people for reasons that make no sense. Women in particular tend to get the short end of the stick every time, and end up suffering at the hands of both men and their fellow women. Whether it be physical abuse, mental abuse, or any kind of abuse for that matter, no one should have to go through those kinds of horrors. There was a brightness to his blue eyes when he looked at her, knowing that young women have someone like you in their corner, someone who fights for them and shows them kindness and a helping hand. It proves my assumption about you was correct. He went back to his cleaning, though not before saying, by the way, your meal's on the house today. Think of it as my way of saying thank you. Returning to his work, the face Artemis sent his way went unnoticed. The goddess of the moon could do little but stare silently at the blonde, her crumb-covered mouth partially open as she gawped at him. This mortal, this man, continued to baffle her. She was 4,593 years old, and she could say with all certainty, she had never been praised by a male mortal in such a way before, one that wasn't a demigod, or had any connection to their Olympian family. Even Zeus, who doted on her and Athena like they were still small goddesses he could pick up and lift onto his shoulders, had never praised her for her work in such form. It was always something regarding her skill as a warrior, and never as a nurturer. People forgot, and she included her family in that category, that she was more than just the goddess of the hunt and the moon. She was also the patron of young women and children and held divine authority over childbirth alongside her sister, Ilithyia, thanks in part for delivering her twin Apollo from their mother. She could be nurturing and loving. She didn't have children of her own out of choice early in her life, but she showed compassion and kindness to children of both genders regardless of the sins of the parents. Her hunters could attest to that. This man, he was confusing her. The first time they met and he surprised her behind the counter, she thought he was like all the rest. She thought he would be cocky, arrogant or overconfident with his talents as a chef. The rest of the world would be if they possessed a tenth of his culinary talent. However, Artemis was pleased that she had listened to Athena and given him a chance to prove himself to be unlike the others. He was confident, but not overly so. He took compliments with grace and no shortage of embarrassment, and his sunny disposition and kindness had wormed its way into the good graces of many of her family members. He was a good one. Artemis had come to that realization. You don't have to do that, she replied. She watched him blink. I know I don't have to. He looked up from the floor, and smiled in her direction. But I want to. She was prepared to argue her point but stopped when he sent her a light scolding expression. Take the offer. I'm only offering it today. Use this chance wisely. There was a hint of a challenge in his tone. The goddess huffed and crossed her arms. Beneath the table, her foot tapped against the floor in mild annoyance. Fine then. If he was serious about her not paying, then she was going to take advantage of his kind offer. She hoped he was ready because her sweet tooth was already returning in force. His kindness would be his downfall because she planned on upping her appetite to the next level. Outside across the street from the fox's den, as the blonde shinobi and the goddess of the hunt conversed with each other, little did they know another Olympian was also in the neighborhood. This Olympian had been made a fool of by the blonde, and thanks to him became the butt of the joke by his family and came looking for revenge. He didn't know who it was, but someone had leaked to his Olympian family what had occurred that fateful day and he hadn't heard the end of it. Everyone, including his father, would snicker every time he walked into the room, and his brothers had become intolerable. Apollo and Ares were on his case every free moment he had and it was making his itch boil. Even Poseidon caught wind of it beneath the sea, and Iris messaged him for the sole purpose of pointing and laughing at him. He couldn't stand it. He was sure it wasn't Hestia. His lovable aunt would never betray him in such a form. Maybe it was the nymphs, but he doubted any were brave enough. Satyrs? No, not the satyrs. They would never betray him. No, he bet it was that damned Terminus. That stupid border god loved to make his life miserable. Oh, when he was finished with the blonde, Terminus was next. That was for damn sure. I got you now, you conniving SOB, Hermes whispered, his blue eyes narrowing at his foe. Wrapped in the mist, he remained hidden and out of sight from his foe. Next to him, the dark-haired god patted his secret weapon that would even out the scales and delivers to him his sweet retribution. Like he promised to his aunt, he wasn't going to kill the mortal. However, that didn't mean he couldn't hurt the mortal. It wouldn't be too severe, but it would be funny. What was his weapon of choice? He could have gone with a couple of choices. However, his genius mind had settled on a Hephaestus-grade mashed potato cannon. It had taken some bribing since his elder brother didn't do anything for free, and a great amount of patience, but he finally convinced the god of the forge to go through with his request. Modeled after one of the old 24-pounder long guns used by the world's navies between the 17th and 19th centuries, the only difference between his one and the old models was that his shot out mashed potato at a frightening speed and was capable of shooting through a tree. He tested it once the other day, and it was safe to say, Ares had not been too happy at being his test dummy. The god of war had been exiting his temple when he was hit by a condensed shot of mashed potato and was sent sprawling through his home yelling and cursing. He hadn't realized Aphrodite had been visiting, and the lump he called his brother had landed on top of her, covering her in mashed potato and ruining her dress. The goddess of love had given him an earful later on, but it was worth it. All he had to do now was catch Naruto at the right moment and lay him out with his glorious cannon. There was only one issue with his plan, and it was one he hadn't been counting on. Hermes had hoped the blonde would be alone to avoid additional casualties. He didn't think Artemis of all people would be there at this exact moment. However, as unwise as it was with the goddess of the moon present, Hermes would carry on undeterred. His schedule over the next month was hectic, and that was putting it mildly. It was now or never, even if it meant upsetting his dangerous and temperamental older sister. Come on Hermes, you beautiful man, you got this, he repeated to himself, psyching himself up. Naruto whistled. Boy, you sure showed me. Staring at the plates and cups that were piled high around her table, the blonde couldn't do anything but admire the auburn-haired woman's determination and seemingly bottomless pit she called a stomach. It reminded him of himself. You know, I wonder if that's some kind of new record. Maybe I should have your face framed and put on display on the back wall for all to see. Wiping her face with the napkins provided, the happy expression plastered on her face bordered on smugness. She wasn't sure how long it had been since she'd self-indulged to such a degree, but it was hard to care about such thoughts when she felt so pleasantly full. Her appetite was something of infamy on Olympus, and despite being notably smaller than her divine brothers, and some of her sisters, Artemis could outlast all of them when it came to food. Most of the time she could restrain herself, but being told everything was on the house for one day only, restraint had gone out of the window. How gluttony wasn't one of her domains still mystified her. I'd ask where it all goes, but I know questions like that could get me in trouble with women, Artemis snorted. Smart man. It's nice to see a man with a brain for once. Naruto bowed in response. I suppose I should leave you be, and let you go home. I've been here an hour longer than I intended. She needed to get back to her hunters. Zoe, in particular, would be wondering where she had gotten to. Thank you for your time and patience, and thank you for staying open longer for me. The gesture is appreciated. Hopefully, I'll be able to come back sooner. She stood from the table and dusted off the crumbs from her shirt. I look forward to it, Naruto replied, looking at the high pile of plates and cups. He was never more thankful for his dishwasher than he was right now. Despite being kept longer at the fox's den than he'd hoped, he found himself enjoying the small talk that began between himself and Artemis. They went back and forth on whatever crossed their minds, and he found himself enjoying her company. It was nice talking to someone who wasn't one of his clones. Artemis had the same thoughts, though wouldn't admit it out loud. The mortal man was alright in her books. An idea popped into his head, and he motioned for Artemis to wait for a moment. Watching him disappear, Artemis stood by the counter, watching the door that led to the kitchen and listening to the movements and mutterings of the blonde. What in the world is he doing? She wondered. When a minute passed, she was about to head towards the door when Naruto came waltzing out, pushing the door open with his left leg and carrying two large white paper boxes in his arms. What's this? Just something from me to you, he replied. You said you see your group regularly. Next time you see them, treat them to what's in the boxes. He smiled and lifted one of the lids, revealing the inside of the box. The inside was littered with goodies that would have made Artemis salivate with greed. Dozens of cookies were piled high on each other, with gooey chocolate on the inside. The smell made Artemis close her eyes, taking in the scent. Maybe she could make some room after in her stomach after all. The other one has lemon squares. There should be enough for everyone to have a couple each. This is very kind of you. You don't have to do this. She watched him turn to look at her, blue meeting silver. She knew his eyes were blue, but she never noticed how blue they were. They were more vibrant than Apollo's, and even her father's. Like I said earlier, I know I don't have to, but I want to. His smile widened, and shrugged. Maybe if you and your group are ever in the neighborhood, you could come and visit. I'll treat them all to hot chocolates and cakes. Closing the lid shut, Artemis placed one box on top of the other and lifted them into her arms. That wasn't a bad idea. She had a feeling her hunters would come to like this place as well if given the chance to visit. Sure, that would be nice. His face brightened. Then until next time, she replied, and starting moving. Could you get the door for me? My hands are a little full at the moment. Sure. He wandered over and pulled the door open, bowing low in an overdramatic fashion. The action was enough to make her snort, though in amusement rather than annoyance. Thank you. Taking one last look at the blonde, her face frowned when she looked down at his shoes, pointing out, "Your shoelaces are untied, huh?" Blinking, he looked down and saw she was right. "So they are. Thanks." Crouching down to tie his laces, Naruto was none the wiser when out of nowhere, a loud bang erupted in the air and he felt something was past the top of his head at tremendous speeds, grazing the tips of his hair. He almost jumped up in surprise and felt something splash against his cheek as a thud followed after. He spun around, noticing none of the people out in the street appeared bothered by the loud noise, and searched the pavement for anything that could have resulted in such a loud noise. What the hell was that, he thought. For a moment, he thought he saw movement in the alleyway opposite the fox's den. He could sense something across the street, but whatever it was masking its presence and trying to keep itself hidden. It felt familiar, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Touching his cheek, he wiped off the residue from whatever splashed against him. He stared at it for a couple of seconds before realization hit him. Is this mashed potato? Why in the world was mashed potato flying through the air? "Hey, do you know," he started to say, but his words died in his mouth when he got a look at Artemis. Oh boy, to say Artemis had been unlucky would be an understatement. The goddess of the moon and the hunt, who moments ago was happier and more content than she had been in months, was now on the other side of the room with her back resting against the wall of the fox's den, cracks covering the wall like a spider's web. The impact of the mashed potato from across the street had caught her unguarded, and tossed her through the air and into a sitting position, her legs out in front of her and arms wrapped around the cake boxes in a vice-like grip. Her body was covered with mashed potato from head to toe, with large clumps of it wrangled in her hair and up her nose. Naruto couldn't say a word and watched as the realization of what happened slowly dawned on Artemis. Her face, once wearing an amused smile, quickly morphed into one of pure fury that Naruto wouldn't wish on his worst enemy. He let out a gulp and got to his feet. Reaching behind the counter, he pulled out a towel and wordlessly handed it to Artemis, who took the towel and wiped the vegetable residue off her face. Her silver eyes zeroed in on the alleyway, like a lion who found its prey and got to her feet. She turned her attention to the gobsmacked Naruto and handed back the towel, which he gingerly accepted. "Thank you. If you would excuse me, it appears I need to make a trip home," and she trailed off mid-sentence, her rage consuming her body. The blonde could do little more than nod his head as the auburn-haired goddess left the fox's den, cold fury taking over her entire person. He idly noticed her make a motion to her neck, dragging a finger across the jugular before disappearing from view. Turning around and now on his own, Naruto sighed when he noticed it wasn't just Artemis that was covered in mashed potato, but now potato was strewn across the inside of the den on every side. "I just want to go home," he muttered, before beginning his clean-up again. "Run, Hermes, run as you've never run before," Hermes muttered to himself, running across Olympus and leaving a trail behind him as fear encased his entire being. That damn blonde, why did he have to duck at that exact moment running across his ancestral home? The god of messengers thought about his options. The mortal realm was out of the question. Artemis would find him in a heartbeat. His temple was out of the question, and the unsaid rule about gods not barging into others' temples would go widely unnoticed in this situation. He doubted his sister cared for that rule with all that rage coursing through her. He ran through his options. Apollo isn't here, nor is Ares.
The blue eyes belonging to Naruto Uzumaki snapped open with the shinobi bursting up from his bed. His breathing was deep and ragged, with a sheen of sweat covering his forehead. Around the crew neck of his white t-shirt, drips of sweat darkened the fabric and stuck to the skin beneath. His body shook as his left hand came up and gently patted his chest, trying to regain control over his breathing. He crouched to one knee next to the bed, his free hand running his palm across the smooth fabric of the bedsheets as he felt the adrenaline begin to leave his body. After a couple of minutes, he changed his position and sat with his back resting against the bed. His head leaned back, staring up at the ceiling while he switched his bedside lamp on. Next to the lamp sat his alarm clock, displaying the time, 4:01 a.m. He still had an hour before he needed to get up, but something told him he wouldn't be falling back to sleep. What the hell was that? His dream, or nightmare, whichever he wanted to refer to it as, had been so vivid. Sometimes when people dreamed, their bodies switched to a kind of autopilot and went through the motions of the story that was playing out. Other times, they would watch themselves in the third person, watching the choices they were making. It was like a cinematic dream, and the person was watching a movie play out in their mind. This one, however, was a lucid dream, and Naruto was in control of his every action. He didn't dream often, but when he did his mind got creative. Hinata, of course, the dream was about Hinata. His late wife had been on his mind for weeks now, ever since the Underhills visited the Fox's den for their Valentine's Day. At first, it was random thoughts popping into his mind here and there. He'd been eating a bowl of ramen in his living room when his thoughts turned to the evening Hinata outclassed himself and Choji to become the undisputed ramen-eating champion of Isuraku ramen. To this day, he didn't know how she did it, or where all that ramen went. Other times he thought about their afternoons together in their garden after he made himself some tea. Hinata was a master when it came to brewing tea and tea ceremonies. She taught him everything she knew about brewing tea leaves and getting the taste just right. Most mornings, when he woke up, his hand instinctively reached out to what would have been Hinata's side of the bed, wanting to feel her warm body beneath his fingertips. Now, it was just the cool surface of the sheets. In the dream, it felt so real. Hinata had been right in front of him, barely a meter away and in touching distance from his hands. She looked as she did when Bolt started attending the ninja academy, with her lavender jumper and her hair falling just above her shoulders. She was as beautiful as he remembered and called out to her, but his voice was unnaturally silent. He took a step forward, and Hinata was pushed back a step. This went on for what felt like an eternity as the distance between them remained the same. They were so close, and yet she was a fingertip away. He started running, his arms stretched out as far as they would go, but still, he couldn't reach her. Then the ground started to shake. No! Her face became a picture of terror, her eyes as wide as the moon as the ground beneath her feet became less solid and stable. Dirt began to rise as Hinata started to sink into the earth, reaching her shins in a matter of seconds. Naruto's actions became more frenzied, and his voice, despite being silent, became raw as he wore out his throat muscles from his voiceless shouts. In a matter of moments, he was forced to watch as the dirt reached her neck, her body disappearing beneath the ground as her pale eyes looked at him for help. Don't take her from me. His thoughts went unanswered, watching as the face of his wife disappeared entirely, the earth swallowing her body to make it look as if Hinata had never existed at all. Falling to the ground, the sobbing blonde couldn't do anything as he brought down his fist repeatedly against the ground, try as he might into forcing it to give his wife back. Each hit fell more silent after the other, until he was little more than a sobbing mess, his face covered in a mixture of dirt, snot and tears. Give her back. The ground shook again, and he felt the earth beneath his body begin to ripple and move around. Jumping up from the ground, he paced backwards a couple of steps and watched with pained eyes as the dirt began taking the shape of a feminine face. The eyes, the nose and mouth all took shape, with the face being as large as king-size mattress. The mouth parted, spitting up dirt and rocks into the air while her eyes burst open with eyes a mixture of moss and coal. Just looking at the face made him fearful and angry at the same time as his hands clenched into tightly bound fists. You, he remembered roaring, his voice returning to him at last. Haven't you done enough? All he got back was a peal of laughter reminiscent of two stones grating against each other. The eyes looked at him through the laughter, the moss growing a brighter shade of green. The laughter went on and on until finally, his rage got the better of him as a Rasengan formed in his hand. It grew to the size of a basketball initially, before continuing to grow until it was the size of a small car. Throwing his arm forward, the A-ranked jutsu collided with the face, destroying its shape and kicking up an explosion, though the laughter continued until it became more a heckle. The next thing he knew, he was awake and jumping to his feet, surveying the room after his not-so-pleasant dream. He winced when he noticed the spider web cracks that now decorated his bedroom. He hadn't realized until now that his chakra must have been leaking while he was dreaming, causing the room to shift as it took a turn for the worst. He was going to need to fix that at some point. Well, I doubt I'm going back to sleep now, he muttered mentally, telling himself to add it to the list of things he needed to do around the house. The house he bought was a bit of fixer-upper and hadn't been well maintained by the previous owner. Slowly, he'd been going around the old red brick Greek townhouse and turning into a home to be proud of. He didn't like all the new builds you saw walking the streets of New York. He'd grown to appreciate the buildings with a bit of history, the ones with a story to it. This one in particular, dated back to 1846. Throwing his sleep clothes to the bed and making his way to the bathroom, he soon found himself sighing in relief as the hot water of his shower doused his body. He felt his stiff joints begin waking up from their dormant state. I hope today's a quiet day, he thought before humming and reaching for the shampoo. For many across the world, New York City was a playground for the wealthy and the beautiful. Any given sidewalk was full of men and women who were more beautiful than the last and wasn't afraid to show off that great beauty. As one of the world's leading hubs in fashion and beauty cosmetics, mortals from all over the world would flock to grab a piece of the fame that came with being beautiful. Often enough, people would stop and stare at a beautiful woman, or a handsome man as they walked past, their desire reaching the surface, while their minds reminded them it would never be. Sometimes when a celebrity of notable fame was passing through, people would flock to them like a pack of rabid dogs. In this case, the entire sidewalk, as well as the sidewalk across the road, had stopped dead in their tracks. Waves of desire hit the mortals like they were being thrown into a head-on collision with a truck as their eyes followed the most beautiful woman and the most handsome man they had ever seen. With a skip in her step, Aphrodite soaked up the attention sent her way like a sponge soaking up water. Dressed in form-hugging jeans and cream-colored top, Her heels clicked along the pavement as she sent a cheeky wink in the direction of a group of men who were too busy falling over themselves to care how stupid they looked. I think today's going to be a wonderful day, Aphrodite giggled, watching as a man across the street walked into a streetlight, while an older gentleman was being glared at by his wife as his hands roamed over his chest. The glare didn't last long as the woman soon became transfixed by the man that walked a step behind Aphrodite. His hands were tucked into his jeans, his long blonde hair tied back in a man bun and a pair of sunglasses resting on his head. His upper half was covered in nothing but a form-fitting sleeveless white t-shirt, showing off his muscled and bronze physique and arms that left the mortals a puddle of goo. To a mortal, it looked as if the man had stepped out of Baywatch. His shining eyes held the same joy for life that the love goddess possessed, scanning over both the men and women he passed by. His smile figuratively and literally brightened up the sky, as clouds parted to make way for the beautiful golden rays of the sun. When Aphrodite came barging into his golden temple on Olympus, the god of the sun didn't need convincing to spend the afternoon with her. Apollo determined from the first day he met the love goddess, life would never get boring on Olympus with Aphrodite around. When the twins of Zeus and Leto arrived together on Olympus, Aphrodite initially had gone to Artemis, trying to woo her with her silver tongue and mold the younger Olympian into another version of herself. Unfortunately for her, she arrived on Olympus not long before they did, but the whispers and rumors about Aphrodite's promiscuous nature had already woven its way into Artemis's ears. The goddess of the moon was quick to keep her at a distance. Instead, she chose to side with Athena, and the goddess of wisdom had been delighted to take her little sister under her wing and show her the ropes around their godly home. Though disappointed, Aphrodite instead turned her attention to the younger of the twins and was quick to snatch the young god into her claws, showing off her immense beauty to the young Olympian. Along with Apollo inheriting his father's lust for anything with two legs, it didn't take long for the god of the sun to become Olympus's biggest playboy. She and Apollo were like two peas in a pod, as the mortals would say, and she could say he was the god she got along with the most, minus Ares and Hestia. Granted, their relationship did strain for a while due to the whole business between Apollo and Eros, but that was all in the past. These days, when she needed a good night out, or to endlessly gossip about the handsome men and beautiful women she'd brought to her bed, Apollo was her go-to guy. "Dite, how much further is this place?" "Not long, my dear Apollo." "Not long," she said, and noticed his pouty face staring back at her. "What's the matter? You're not still mad, are you?" "Yes, I'm still mad." He waved his hands in the air like a hot-tempered child, breaking the aura of smooth and handsome he loved to expel so much. "Why didn't you bring me with you when you, Athena and Arti went to this place?" "I had to hear about it from Hermes, and he heard about it from Ares, who heard about it from Dad. I wanted to go too, honey. It was impromptu and it was a girl's day. You were not a girl, and you weren't around. What was I supposed to do?" "You could have Iris messaged," he mumbled, kicking an empty can to the side of the sidewalk. Looping her arms through his, Aphrodite giggled and patted his cheek. Around them, the male mortals were wishing they were Apollo, while the women wished they were the ones holding onto his bicep. "I'm very sorry for not including you. Next time, I'll make sure to send you an Iris message." She squeezed his bicep. "Forgive me." She leaned up and kissed him on the cheek, causing the mortals to nearly combust. His shining blue eyes took one look at her quivering lip before his attitude did a 180. "I can't stay mad at you, Dite. At least, not for long anyway." His attention turned back to the sidewalk, his negative feelings disappearing like they were never there to start with. That was their relationship to a T. One moment one could be mad at the other, and the next, they were best friends again. "Man, I'm excited. Is this place as good as they say it is?" "I know nymphs and satyrs tend to exaggerate, but I haven't heard a negative thing from anyone." Aphrodite tried not to grin. "Apollo, trust me when I say it will blow your expectations out of the water. It's that good, it's that good. I Frenched the owner in front of everyone when he gave me the most delicious entremet of my life." Even after all the time that passed, Aphrodite could still taste the apple spice on her lips, driving her taste buds wild with desire. Her smile turned coy. "I heard Artemis has even been visiting him on her own in her downtime." Apollo gasped at his Olympian bestie. "No way, honey. Very way, but Lil Sis doesn't like anyone. She doesn't even like me on most days." Apollo could think back to all the times he tried to get his sister to come around and lessen her hate towards men, and each time it blew up in his face like a bolt of lightning to the crotch. To think, some no-name guy mortal with a talent for making good food and coffees could earn his sister's respect and, dare he say, affection. This guy must have been the real deal. His eyes narrowed, and a pout wove onto his face. This guy better not be trying to put the moves on my lil sis. Oblivious to Apollo's thoughts, Aphrodite's smile could melt the icest of hearts. "I know." Which makes him all the more incredible. They rounded the corner of the street and the familiar orange frame of the Fox's Den came into view. Smiling with glee, Aphrodite pulled Apollo harder, nearly causing the sun god to trip over his own feet. There it is. It was hard for him to miss. Wow, that's a bright-looking building. It's almost as bright as my temple. Avoiding the mortals that were gaping at them, it didn't take long before the goddess of love was pushing the door open, and the familiar rich smell of coffee and pastries assaulted her senses. She sighed in pure delight as the warmth tickled her skin. It was just how she remembered from her last visit. The room was half filled, mostly by pairs and couples, though a table consisting of a nymph and a satyr stuck out to the pair off in the back. Nothing had changed, and Aphrodite was glad. Prying Aphrodite's hands off his arm, Apollo was quick to fall into a similar state as his immortal relative. Taking one long whiff of the delightful aroma, Apollo visibly relaxed. It smells amazing. For a first impression, Apollo was impressed. The fox's den looked like a place he could frequent. Eyes scanning the room, his gaze was quick to settle on the beautiful nymph dining with the satyr. Whoa, look at that hottie. Long dark hair and magenta eyes. He couldn't help but lick his lips at the curves she was sporting. I call dibs. Aphrodite shrugged, her colorful eyes scanning the room for her prey. You can have her. I'm here for a much bigger fish. It only took a moment before the goddess of love found her target, who had his back to her and was in the middle of taking an order from a couple sitting in one of the middle tables. Tilting her head, it was Aphrodite's turn to lick her lips, her eyes staring at Naruto's ass. Mama likes. Apollo was quick to notice him. So that's the guy, he asked, looking Naruto up and down. Tall, check. Tanned, check. Blonde, check. Great physique if the clothes are to go by, check. Handsome, must be if you like him. Apollo went silent for a moment, tapping the side of his chin with his finger, before asking, share him with me? Nope. Aphrodite shook her head vehemently. He's all mine. Find your own handsome man. Besides, I don't think he swings that way. Shrugging, Apollo turned his focus back on the nymph, who was now eyeing him curiously from the back of the room. A grin appeared on his face and sent a wink her way. Gotcha, he thought as he watched begin to giggle. The satyr could only groan. Ignoring Apollo, Aphrodite decided to make herself known to the blonde and silent skipped across the room. Years of practice in high heels had paid off as each step was as silent as a feline, her body weaving through the tables and chairs like a snake in the grass. Ignoring the looks from the mortals, Aphrodite found herself a step away from the den's owner as he finished jotting down the last of the orders. Reaching up with her hand, her fingers delicately traced along his shoulders. Hi there, hand. Wahhhh. The goddess of love couldn't do anything but let out a screech as she found herself being caught by the arm and thrown unceremoniously over the shoulder of her hunky target, her body going slack when it hit the ground with her long hair splayed out around her. Her eyes were wide while her body was spread out like an eagle, somehow narrowly avoiding colliding with one of the nearby tables, though her limbs were grazing a couple of legs of some chairs. Back with Apollo, the god of the sun could only gape as he watched an Olympian just get judo thrown by a mortal. If Artemis was here, she'd be rolling on the floor laughing. While Aphrodite looked up in silent shock as she regained her bearings, a stunned Naruto had frozen on the spot. His mouth was in the shape of an O, as he looked down at the beautiful woman he'd just assaulted by mistake. Oh god, he hadn't sensed her coming, nor did he sense the friend she brought with her. He hadn't been paying attention and somehow allowed this woman to sneak upon him. He hadn't meant to throw her over his shoulder. He just reacted. He'd been sluggish all day, the nightmare from earlier that morning playing over and over again in his thoughts since he left home that morning. He'd made a couple of mistakes that morning, and now he'd made the biggest mistake since he opened. Ow, handsome, what was that for? Aphrodite whined, propping herself up on her elbows and wore a pout. I was just coming to say hello. Shaking out of his thoughts, Naruto quickly crouched down and took her hands into his own, his worry for his customer overriding his nightmare. I am so sorry, I don't know what came over me. Are you okay? He checked her over, his hands and eyes roaming over her body like a doctor in an emergency room. You didn't hit your head or anything, did you? Around the room, he could hear his customers murmuring to themselves, making the blonde shinobi gulp. This wasn't good. To his relief, a giggle from the love goddess stopped the murmurs. Still propped up on her elbows, Aphrodite had to admit, while this wasn't exactly what she had planned, feeling his hand roaming her body checking for injuries was a good substitution. Lifting a hand, Naruto was quick to take it and pull her back to her feet. You're lucky you're handsome, otherwise, I'd slap you silly. You don't throw a girl over your shoulder, you know. Quickly fixing her hair, Aphrodite then added, don't worry though, I'm sturdier than I look. Thank goodness, he sighed. Someone with her power wouldn't have been hurt that easily, at least, he hoped not. Getting a good look at him, Aphrodite noticed the dark shade underneath his eyes. You look tired, honey. Have you not been sleeping? No wonder he was so jumpy. Throwing up his hands, Aphrodite allowed him to gently guide her over to a nearby table by the window. Don't worry about me. Come on, I'll show you to a table. Everything is on the house today after that incident. AWW, thank you. handsome, that's nice of you." Taking her seat, she ushered for Apollo to take the seat in front of her, distracting him as he silently mouthed something to the nymph. Once he strode over, he extended his hand to his fellow blonde, who gathered a pair of menus for them. "Hey, the name's Apollo. Nice to meet you. Hi. I'm Naruto." Naruto replied, scratching the back of his head. "Sorry about what I just did to your friend." "It's cool." As Dite said, "She's tougher than she looks. If she can handle dating someone like my older brother, then she can handle just about anyone. Not to mention, she's survived scrapes with my sister, which is no easy featuring." Apollo replied, noting the strong grip from his fellow blonde and the callus on his skin. He must have been a hard worker to attain such hands. "Naruto, that sounds Japanese, right, man? I haven't been to Japan for a long time." "That's right, you don't look Japanese." "I get that a lot." Parents with a flair for exotic names. Listening to Apollo hum, Naruto turned back to Aphrodite, noting what his fellow blonde mentioned. "You're in a relationship?" he asked, before adding, "You weren't with someone when you kissed me, were you?" Sending a glare to her Olympian bestie, the love goddess rested her head in the palm of her hand, her ankles crossing beneath the table. "Don't worry, honey. I guess you could say my relationship status is always open. I'm not the type to get tied down, just to have fun and see where the breeze takes me, if you know what I mean." She winked and giggled as his nervous laugh. "Don't be uptight about such things. It's perfectly natural, right? I guess that's true." Still giggling, Aphrodite opened up her menu. "How about some milkshakes to start?" "I'll take a strawberry one, and Apollo will take chocolate." "I want it just like you made it the last time I was here." Smiling and getting over his earlier embarrassment, Naruto gave them a nod. "Sure. Think about what else you'd like, and I'll take some orders down when I come back with your drinks." "Perfect." When he walked away, her foot was quick to kick Apollo's shin, forcing the sun god to wince. "Ow. What was that for?" "What did I do?" She leveled him with another glare. "What did he do? How was it not obvious? Why in Hades' name did you mention my relationship with Ares?" "I'm trying to get this guy into my bed and have my way with him." By telling him about Ares, Apollo potentially just made it more difficult for her seductions to work. "I swear, Apollo, if you do something to get in my way of that hunky man, I'll curse you to have the hots for." For Artemis, that very threat was the worst nightmare of Apollo and his twin, and the sun god couldn't help but squirm in his seat. "You wouldn't? You bet I would. That's disgusting." He shook his head from side to side. "Don't ever say those words again. Then keep this shut when it comes to my past lovers and exploits." She made a zip motion with her mouth and tossed it over her shoulder. "Capish?" Gulping, Apollo nodded like a madman. He was staying on his female bestie's good side. She could be more frightening than Zeus if given the chance. The pair sat in silence for a couple of minutes, one humming a song in his mind, while the other frowned, an arm crossed beneath her chest. Both had their heads deep inside the menu, their minds running 1,000 miles an hour as they tried to decide what to have. The options were too vast and plenty, and like the other gods that visited, Apollo was sure he had never seen such a wide variety of options before. It was like all the best hits over the years were in this one cafe, and each one was making his godly tastabuds salivate with hunger. That wasn't the only thing making him salivate in hunger, although this was a different kind of hunger. He looked over his shoulder, and couldn't stop the grin when he noticed the nymph was looking at him from the corner of her eyes. Her petite hands idly picked up the strawberry sitting atop of her cake and proceeded to eat it in a way that would leave most men a drooling mess. Case in point, the red-faced satyr with a front seat view. "Oh man, she wants it," the god of the sun thought, trying not to be too blatantly obvious by his lust. For the goddess of love, she needed something of equal measure to the apple spice entremet she had last time. There was a couple of dishes that stood out, but nothing felt quite right. She needed something special to brag about to the other goddesses. Oh, she had heard from some of the gossiping nymphs around Olympus about the delightful treats and wonders Naruto had made that D-list goddess, Persephone, having been turned away from the fox's den the last time she visited thanks to that annoying little daughter of Demeter. She got the full scoop and it made her itch a boil with jealousy. Eyes scanning over the delicacies, Aphrodite halted when she got to the selection of pies. If it was anywhere else, she would have found it strange that a cafe was serving pies of all things, but like the rest of her family, she expected nothing less from the over-the-top business with a dreamy delicious owner. A plan began to formulate in her mind, and a cat-like grin took over. It didn't take long for Naruto to return, a pair of breathtakingly gorgeous milkshakes being lowered onto the table. Like before, Aphrodite's eyes gleamed at the sight of the sweet treat, while Apollo couldn't help but gaze at the perfectly ratioed drink. The sweet smell of the hazelnut chocolate wafted around his nose, and the sun god couldn't help but bite his lip. He wanted a taste so bad. "Here's your milkshakes, I hope you enjoy," Naruto said, watching as Aphrodite's face lit up as the sweet taste engulfed her senses. Oh, it was as good as she remembered. In front of her, Apollo slipped into a similar state, ignorant of the chocolate mustache across the top of his lip. He could taste hazelnut chocolate, dark chocolate, white chocolate. It was an abundance of chocolate in a milkshake like he'd never tasted before. It was amazing. No wonder Artie loves this place. So, have you thought about the rest of your order? We have, Aphrodite replied, and motioned for Apollo to go first. The god of the sun shrugged. He took one last quick peep from the menu, where one particular dish caught his eye numerous times. Could I get a plate of the mochi, please? That little nugget shined like a star in the night sky, his eyes always returning to the list of flavors provided. He loved the stuff, and he hadn't gorged himself on the Japanese delicacy in years. Sure, what flavors would you like? Apollo pondered for a moment, tapping his tongue against his cheek. Could I get 3 of the coconut, 3 of the pineapple, and 3 of the green tea? Absolutely. Great choice, Naruto commended, before turning his head to Aphrodite, and for the lady. Giggling, Aphrodite lowered the menu, slyly pushing out her chest and tempting the blonde to sneak a peek down her top. To increase her chances at tempting him, she lowered the strap to her top down to her shoulder, leaving her creamy skin to proudly bask in the sunlight. No mortal or immortal man could resist the temptation to look down a gorgeous woman's top. It was, as the mortals would say, just science. The goddess of love had no competition when it came to her girls. Sure, the other goddesses were decent enough, even Hestia, when she wasn't hiding them behind all that brown fabric. However, they were no match for her. Despite what they might claim, she was the most beautiful, and the most desired. She did receive the apple of discord from Paris after all. Fluttering her eyelashes, she bit the side of her lip. I would love to have a piece of your salted caramel banana cream pie. It sounds to die for. Annoyingly for Aphrodite, the hunky blonde brought his notepad closer to his face, blocking out the beautiful view of her exquisite chest and therefore rendering him unaffected by her form. Sure, I'll bring that out to you shortly. Another great choice. When he started walking away, Aphrodite scrunched up her face, and let out a loud huff. Damn it, why was this so hard? Beneath the table, she kicked Apollo in the shin once more, startling the sun god while he was making googly eyes at the nymph. Ow, what did I do this time? Sorry, but this turning out to be more of a challenge than I thought. Her eyes became determined. But don't worry, I have a plan to lure him in, and it's sure to work. The blonde head god shook his head. Sure, Dite. Whatever you say, he replied, before returning to stare and make gestures at the nymph. He brought up his hands, and with one hand made an O shape, while the other flexed his index finger. Grinning, Apollo began thrusting the finger through the hole and motioned with his head to the restrooms across the room. As great as the milkshake was, the sun god only had one thing on his mind right now. Unbeknownst to the pair of Olympians, Aphrodite's attempts had not been a complete failure. Good job, Naruto, you didn't look down. You get a pat on the shoulder later, he thought, trying to control the blush on his cheeks. That woman, he couldn't deny how beautiful she was and how difficult it was being around her. It was like he hated to say it, but his libido was getting supercharged. Bringing the notebook up to his face to hide her cleavage had been a swift idea, and tried to rotate his eyes between the notepad and her eyes. Those beautiful, soul-crushing, damn it, stop thinking about it. Pushing those thoughts away, he went to the back and readied their order. Falling back in her chair, Aphrodite did nothing but watch the people in the room. There were a couple of men and women that took her fancy. The couple sitting a few tables away from her, in particular, looked her type. On any other day, she would have walked straight over and threw some fancy words their way and taken them both away with her. Today though, she was intent on wrapping the hunky blonde up in her arms and legs. Maybe she needed to kiss him again. Add a little tongue this time. Humming to herself, she didn't appear interested when the nymph making googly eyes with Apollo got up from her table and walked past their table. Her finger ran across the sun god's shoulder and whispered something in his ears. A coy grin appeared on her face, before making her way to the restroom, swaying her hips in a way that hypnotized the Olympian. After a minute passed, Apollo jumped up from his seat. Bathroom break. Be back in 10, no, 15 minutes, sure honey. Enjoy. Aphrodite waved her hand and idly watched as Apollo walked across the room and slipped into the restroom. The last thing she heard as the door closed was the sound of a high-pitched giggle and a bark of laughter from the younger Olympian. From across the room, the satyr slumped his shoulders and left some money on the table before getting up and leaving. Today had been a bust on a godly level. 5 minutes later, as she sipped on her milkshake, Naruto appeared next to her table, a tray in his hand and his ever-present smile on his face. Oh, she was loving that smile. How could she resist? He motioned to the empty on the table. Where did your friend go? The restroom. I guess he couldn't hold it in. She shrugged and licked her lips as Naruto lowered Apollo's order of the mochi. Admittedly, the goddess of love had never tried mochi before, but Apollo had told her all about it. Normally, Eastern food didn't do much for her, which led to the Olympian rarely visiting the Far East. Unlike other gods who enjoyed traversing through the world and tiptoeing around the other pantheons, she preferred sticking to what she knew. However, Aphrodite had to admit, the mochi's vibrant colors were catching her attention. If I have to guess, the white ones are the coconut flavor, she asked, and looked pleased with herself when Naruto nodded, which means the yellow ones are the pineapple and the green ones are the green tea. Good eye, thank you. I've never had mochi before, though maybe I should try it sometime. I love the colors, and I've never tried Eastern food much. Well, except for my favorite Chinese takeout, she giggled. Really? Well, next time you visit I'll point out some Eastern dishes from the menu, and you could try them. I would like that a lot. Her eyes drifted to the remaining plate on the tray for me, nodding. Naruto lowered the dish and presented the goddess with her order, 1 salted caramel banana cream pie. The goddess of love's eyes lit up with glee. The dessert looked positively scrumptious and perfectly proportioned. A layer of salted caramel was drizzled on the top of the cream, to which Aphrodite could smell tickling her nose. Licking her lips again, Aphrodite took her fork and slices of a small piece before bringing it up to her mouth. A moan of delight erupted from her throat, her eyes closing as she took in the taste. Gods, it tasted good. How the mortal did it, she didn't know. It was like he had the golden hands of the gods when it came to all things pastries and desserts. It was as if Hestia or Hera, or gods forbid, Rhea had blessed him with their culinary talents. She racked her brain on the possibilities. You like? What a silly question. Was the moan not sufficient enough? Dite quipped, taking another bite and releasing a similar response. Seriously? How did he do it? It was mind-boggling. Smiling, Naruto gave a short bow. I'm glad you like it, mademoiselle, giggling. Aphrodite noticed him beginning to turn away and put her plan into action. Digging her fork into her pie, she brought it up to her mouth looking ready to bite down. Instead, she tilted the fork and watched as the piece slid off the fork. Oh no! How clumsy of me! Blinking in surprise, Naruto turned back. He let out before his eye traveled down and pinpointing where the piece of pie landed. Instantly, his eyes widened and his cheeks gained a healthy rosy tint to them. As planned, the piece of Aphrodite's pie landed in the space between her breasts, slavering cream and crumbs across her skin and drew the attention of all the men in the room. Instantly, he grabbed some napkins and held them out for Aphrodite to take, while having the decency to look away. Here, use these to clean yourself up. How kind. Thank you, she replied, though her efforts didn't stop there. Oh no, I think it's gone in my bra. Wait one moment while I fish it out. Delving down, her petite hands disappeared down her top, ensuring that she exposed some extra skin while she fished for the piece of the pie. She could see his will weakening when his eyes kept trying to sneak a peek, though he would look away a moment later. That wouldn't do. Not at all. Excuse me one moment. She turned around and leaned down, jimming the piece out from her top and hearing it dropping to the floor. At the same time, she heard an array of breaths being sucked in, including one from the person she was hoping to hear. When she turned around, she made sure the lacy little number she was wearing beneath her pants was visible for all to see. Not enough to be distasteful, but enough for everyone's imaginations to run wild. It never failed in getting the blood pumping. There it is, she muttered, a coy grin on her face. Before masking it into a smile, she looked up at Naruto with a palm resting against her cheek. What a klutz I can be. That's okay. The blonde shinobi desperately wanted to get back to his other customers. I'm going to get back to work, spult. The blonde shinobi blinked in surprise once more and felt something impact his groin area. Looking down, Naruto found himself staring at the cream and crumb-stained remains of a piece of the banana cream pie covering his pants. He threw his hands up, his mouth forming an O shape as he incredulously stared at Aphrodite. What was that for? Not giving anything away, she feigned shock and grabbed one of the napkins handed to her moments ago. Oh no, look what I've done. I'm so clumsy today. A gleam was in her eyes and leaned forward in her chair. Before Naruto could do or say anything, he found a hand rubbing the napkin over his pants, swatting away the remnants of Aphrodite's desert. Here, let me get that for you. Oh god. A chopped gasp came out of Naruto's mouth and the blonde found himself breathing through his nose significantly harder than before. Around the room, jaws dropped at the action, with the men cursing the blonde's luck. He tried to put a stop to it but found his hands getting swatted away by the beautiful woman, and felt her efforts hasten twicefold. What the hell, he thought, trying not to feel any sense of pleasure from what he was experiencing. He could have sworn her swipes were becoming longer and more drawn out. What is with this woman? He was too shocked by her actions to move. He'd never met a woman who was this bold before. I can't take it anymore, blinking in surprise when he heard the emotionless voice. The god of the underworld and ruler of the dead turned away from the reports in his hands and gazed at the figure stood across from him. The reports were the judgment rulings from the judgment pavilion, detailing the new arrivals to the underworld and where the souls of the departed ended up. Looking at the stack of reports on the table beside his throne, it would take him the better part of the day to get through. Standing in the doorway with a pair of skeletons stationed on either side, his daughter, Melano, stood in all her frightening glory. Ruling as the goddess of ghosts, his daughter opted to wear an appearance straight out of a mortal's nightmares, with half of her face black and hardened like a corpse, and the other half pale and chalky. She looked like a mortal's night terror come to life. In the handful of occasions that Melano showed herself to a mortal in her dual form, they would either pass out from fear or suffer a full breakdown. Most couldn't look past her frightening form, with many in their Olympian family above ground questioning her sanity. Why would a goddess who could take any form she wanted, take a form of something so hideous? Most were not kind, and though deep beneath the earth, Hades heard the whispers about his daughter. The one that always stoked his anger was the one claiming Zeus was her father, fathering Melano with Persephone, resulting in her appearance. Oh, how he would love to get his hands on the person who started that one. Staring at his daughter, his eyebrow raising on his pale face, explain, it came out more like a grunt than a question. Walking across the throne room, Melano stopped at the platform leading up to the throne of Hades and curtsied to her father. You're sulking again? Hades blinked in surprise. Excuse me, I said you're sulking, she repeated, her arms crossing in front of her, and leaned on her right leg. Normally, when mother returns to Olympus for the spring and the summer, you become broody and miserable to be around. I've grown accustomed to your behavior after all these millennia, but this year you've been worse. Hades couldn't stop the frown appearing. Do I need to remind you who you're speaking to, daughter? He asked. His voice was deep, with the walls humming and shaking after each word. Others would be too afraid to stand in Hades' presence. The goddess of ghosts merely scoffed. His daughter's sass was too much like Persephone's. The mother and daughter combo were two of a handful of people that didn't fall prey to the fear that the eldest son of the Titan King extruded. The only people besides them who fell in that category was his elder sister Hestia, and naturally, his mother. The former queen of the Titans never failed to see the good in her oldest son, and would often visit him when she decided to come out of her self-imposed exiles. No, father, but I have noticed a change this year. Mother's absence appears to be affecting you worse this time than in all the previous ones. Her dark eyes, which were reminiscent of freshly earthed coal, gazed into his own, with the goddess taking 2 steps forward until she stood on the first step of the platform. I'm not sure why, but I noticed the two of you were all lovey-dovey with each other during the last weeks of winter, especially after Valentine's Day. The god of the underworld slouched, a disgruntled hum resonating from his throat. So out with it. Why are you in the dumps? She prodded, patiently waiting for an answer. The god of the underworld was not one to talk about his feelings to anyone besides Persephone, but his daughter's words weren't untrue. Persephone's absence from the underworld had been harder to accept these past weeks, and the elder god was having a difficult time not feeling his wife's presence by his side. Time with Persephone was always joyous for Hades. Granted, when they first got together, the first century of their marriage had been an adjustment for the spring goddess. Gone was the green hills and flowery meadows she'd grown up in. In its place, she had to adjust to her new surroundings of death and darkness. Everything was foreign and unknown to her. If truth be told, Hades wasn't sure if Persephone could adjust to the lifestyle that came with being a resident of the underworld. So, instead of waiting for her to adjust, he made it easier and adjusted parts of the underworld to help the process along. Her garden was the first step and proved to be the best positive step he could have taken. He'd seen her eyes light up and visibly noticed the tension between them lessen. When she turned around to thank him, she gave him the first real smile he'd seen her wear. Since then, all Hades wanted to do was make her smile. His fellow underworld deities, namely Charon, Thanatos and occasionally Hecate, when she visited, had all come to accept the spring's goddess's presence. Back to Melano's accusations, before Persephone left for Olympus, their marriage was doing good. No, better than good, they'd been doing amazing. Since they returned from the fox's den, Hades and Persephone had been in a bubble that neither wanted to leave. It was the best they felt in a long time. It was as if their time visiting the mortal establishment had rejuvenated their marriage, injecting fun and love into the veins of matrimony, and made the weight of their godly duties as light as feathers. It was like they were connected by an invisible rope, for neither went anywhere without each other. The other gods residing within the underworld noticed the change in their lord and were all pleased for the positivity floating around them. A happy Persephone led to a happy Hades. A happy Hades led to a happy underworld, and a happy underworld was good for everyone involved. It's nothing, Hades said quietly, his left hand scratching against the armrest of his throne. His hand felt empty without his wife's petite one filling the void. I feel your mother's absence more this season, that's all. The goddess of ghosts said nothing, but she did sympathize with her lord and father. While she and her mother were two vastly different goddesses, the goddess of spring would always find the time to spend with her daughter. Persephone was an attentive mother and could hold back her enthusiasm, unlike the goddess of the harvest. For the first couple of centuries, Melano acted how a moody mortal teenager would act around their parents. She tried to shrug her off, and stick to the shadows and caves she loved so much within her home. However, Persephone was persistent. She would often say Melano acted like her father, being rough and cold on the outside but with a center that was warm and cuddly. She denied it vehemently, but deep down, her mother wasn't wrong. It wasn't just Hades who missed the presence of Persephone. The spring goddess has become an irreplaceable pillar in their lives. I miss her too. It came out as a whisper, but Hades had heard her words. You do, of course, Melano stated in a matter-of-fact tone. Perhaps it would be a good idea for you to get out of the underworld for an afternoon. And go where? Melano shrugged. No idea, but I'm sure it would be a better alternative to sulking around at home. I don't sulk, Hades replied, a frown washing over his face. I brood. There's a difference. Melano raised an eyebrow. Not really. Brooding means to think deeply about something that makes you unhappy. Sulking is a form of self-pity and childishness, she told him, before tapping her chin. Oh, I guess you embody both right now. In that case, stop brooding and sulking and get out of the underworld for an hour, or 4. You do remember I'm the parent here, not to mention the divine ruler of the underworld. Yes, father. So you've mentioned 500,000 times in the last century alone. Hades hummed his dissatisfaction, but didn't voice his annoyance. Perhaps his divine daughter was correct. Maybe he did need to get out of the underworld for a while, at least, for an afternoon. Every time he entered the master suite of his home, he felt his wife's presence. In recent years, Persephone would leave a bottle of her perfume on her dressing table, the one that smelled like primrose and tulips freshly blossomed in the spring. His wife's touch within their home was everywhere and served to make him feel lower than he already did. Gods, he missed her. It was during her absence that his faithfulness to their marriage would often become tested. The oath of the big three that he, Zeus and Poseidon took after World War II came at the right time. Hades was intent on ensuring his wife was the only one he shared a bed with. Thanatos could run the underworld in my place for an afternoon, Hades muttered. The god of death was his right-hand man and his trusted ally against the gods of the Greek pantheon outside of Persephone and Melano. He might even say Thanatos was one of a handful of people the god of the underworld could call his friend. He didn't care much for Olympus, though his friendship with his warmongering nephew was bizarre. Then again, war and death went hand in hand on the battlefield. A reasonable choice, although I could faithfully fill in while you're away, Melano reasoned. Thanatos holding down the fort was a good idea, but as the daughter of Hades, and having spent most of her life within its walls, she felt there was no one better qualified to look after the underworld in her father's stead. Oh no, he retorted, shaking his head and gazing down at his daughter with certainty. If I'm going to the surface world, then you're coming with me. Your mother and I talked about the idea of taking you up to the surface more often, and today seems like a good place to start. If I have to go, then so are you. What? Her voice raised a few octaves and her mouth parted into an O shape. I have no desire to journey to the surface world. I'm needed here. I have important duties to attend to. A snort broke out of Hades, and saw through her words. If you call scaring the mortals that occupy the fields of punishment with your entourage of ghosts, then all the more reason for you to come with me. The god of the underworld gave his daughter a look. You've become a creature of habit. It might do you some good to get outside every once in a while. How many times can you scare Tantalus and Sisyphus until it starts getting old? You've been doing it for centuries. The goddess puffed out her cheeks. This is about you and your sulking. Don't turn this around on me. Brooding, Hades reiterated. It might have started that way, but now I think this could be good for both of us. Some fresh air might do us good. But I know buts. This is happening. Besides, your mother would kill me if she found out you and I weren't spending time together. A wicked grin smirk washed over his face. If your mother can handle being out of her comfort zone for 6 months on Olympus and forced to spend time with my airheaded sister, then you can survive a few hours in the surface world. You haven't left the underworld in nearly a decade. The goddess of ghosts tried to speak, but no words were coming out of her mouth. How did her father manage to turn this around and make it about her? You need to get out more, my daughter. This isn't happening. Looking through the menu provided, Hades could feel the glare coming from the other side of the table. His daughter was angry at him. The goddess of ghosts had sparsely spoken a word since he all but dragged his gloomy daughter out of his palace. She attempted to make a break for it and hide in one of the many caves that she had set up around the underworld, but Hades had been faster. Treating her like she was a little goddess again, the eldest son of the Titan King threw his daughter over his shoulder and carried her away. The act was enough to shock her for a mere moment, before beginning to curse him from behind. Her protests went ignored, though he let out a grunt when she dug her knee into his shoulder. It got worse when they passed Charon, who laughed at Melano's expense. Even the mortal souls being ferried across the Styx pointed at them and got a kick out of her situation. Most wouldn't have imagined the god who many referred to as the Silent One, the Rich One, or his personal favorite, the Father of Fear, would do such a thing. It was such a, dare he say, intimate thing and very unlike a god with the reputation he carried. However, Hades would argue that despite that reputation, he was still a father, and as much as Melano drove him crazy, he did love her. If Hades wanted to embarrass his daughter in front of other gods, then that was his right as a parent. He knew all thunder thighs on Olympus did the same thing to his children when he got the chance, and the same with squid for brains down in Atlantis. Embarrassment, a parent's greatest weapon against their children. I want to go home. Her words made him sigh, and Hades peered over the menu to look at her. Gone was the half-pale, half-corpse form she wore around the underworld. Instead, his daughter wore the look she was born with. From the day she was born, Hades marveled at the similarities between Melano and Persephone. Every little detail, whether it was her nose, her chin or the shape of her eyes, they screamed Persephone. Her eyes were a mismatched pair, with a blue left eye from Persephone, and an intense black eye inherited from himself. The feature was a rarity amongst the gods, though why she hid them was a mystery to him. Her skin was pale, much like himself, and her dark hair was untidy but beautiful, falling in messy ringlets from the bun it was tied in. Her clothes were another matter entirely and couldn't have been more different from Persephone's. She wore dark jeans with rips around the knees and shins, and her feet were covered in top-of-the-line Converses that didn't have a speck of dirt on them. Her top half was in a black Beatles t-shirt and a leather jacket that fit perfectly around her petite frame. If he recalled, the mortals called this being punk. He sighed and shook his head. He didn't understand kids and their angsty feelings. Too bad. You're staying, so you might as well have a look through the menu. It might surprise you, Father. Melano leaned forward. The front of the building is orange. It makes Apollo's temple look like a piece of art in comparison. Who in their right mind would paint the front of a building orange? Hades held his hand up. He wouldn't refute the color of the building dug into his skin. The bright color went against everything he represented. Believe me, Melano, I know. Then tell me, why are we here? Because you said I should get out of the underworld, and this is where I want to go. I like this place. Gods, that was hard for him to say. The food here is top quality stuff, and the drinks aren't half bad either. Those desserts your mother and I brought home with us on Valentine's Day were from here. He gestured to the room. When he and Persephone returned from their outing on Valentine's Day, they stopped in to visit their daughter, before retiring to their chambers for the evening. Melano had taken one bite before she devoured the portions of desserts they brought for her. The fig tea cake was gone before the elder god could blink. Hades had to give her his portion, listening to her whine until he gave in. Gods, why were the women in his life so skilled at wrapping him around their fingers? That was from here it was. The goddess of ghosts swallowed hard, and Hades noticed her visibly relax in her seat. Maybe it wouldn't be a terrible idea to browse through the menu and see what they offered. While she wasn't a glutton, Melano did enjoy the odd treat here and there. The desserts her parents brought home with them had filled her necessary sugar requirements for weeks. Not to mention, the moment she walked inside the quaint little cafe, she felt her body relax as the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled her nose. Perhaps staying for an hour wouldn't hurt. Her curiosity was piquing. Mother has good taste with these types of establishments. Maybe I will like it here. She picked up the menu and flicked to the first page, ignoring the frown on Hades' face. Your mother's taste. I'm the one who brought you here, against my will, and I bet it was Mother's idea to come here. Which means, if you like it, it's only because she dragged you here in the first place, right? There was a quip in her voice, the type that women used when they knew they were correct. On the other side of the table, Hades kept silent and drifted back to the menu. Damn brat, he thought. She had her mother's wit too. Looking at the menu, he flicked the page back to the one with the list of coffees. Amaretto-flavored coffee. How did I miss that first time round? The father and daughter sat in silence, ignoring the hustle and bustle from the mortals around them. It didn't look to be a busy day. Plenty of tables and booths were vacant, though plates were still half filled and mugs were half full. I wonder why, he thought, giving Melano a flat look. The goddess of ghosts had been in such a mood that her divine power started leaking from her control while they walked the streets of the West Village. Though it wasn't close to the level the god of the underworld could exuberate from his form, it was enough to make people shake in their shoes. People on the street avoided her like the plague, running in the opposite direction. Storefronts closed their doors to keep her from walking in. The moment Milno stepped inside the fox's den, the room felt them appear. For once, Hades wasn't the one scaring people away. Melano gave the mortals, nymphs and satyrs a single cold stare before half the room got up and bolted out the door, bowing to them as they left. Knowing where the menus were kept, Hades grabbed a set before sitting down in the middle of the room. Mr. Underhill, he heard and looked up to find the familiar blonde making his way over to the table. I didn't think I'd be seeing you so soon. Welcome back, Underhill, Melano mouthed. but Hades waved the question away. The shinobi of old sensed the man coming but had been too busy keeping the clones in the kitchen occupied. Moments earlier, one of the clones succumbed to boredom decorating a carrot cake and decided to mess with one of the others. One cupcake to the back of the head was enough for an argument to break out, one which the original needed to see to himself. The last thing he needed was for a dozen clones spilling out of the kitchen to the clientele. Thank you. Hades nodded up at Naruto politely and shook his hand. Pen and notepad appeared in Naruto's hands. I see you found the menus. I remember noticing where you kept them. I hope you don't mind. The blonde shook his head. Not at all. He looked over and found Melano staring up at him, an equative look on her face. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. He offered his hand. I'm Naruto Uzumaki, the owner of the Fox's Den. It's nice to meet you. She eyed him curiously. She was a bit put off when he kissed her knuckles, an action he used when meeting Persephone for the first time. It's nice to meet you too, Melano replied quietly. She tilted her head. Her mismatched eyes stared into his sapphire-like ones. This is my daughter, Mel. Hades started, but remembered the phonemes Persephone gave them during their last visit. Thinking on his feet, Hades hoped Melano wouldn't be too insulted. My daughter, Megan, your daughter. Naruto's eyes widened and stared at Melano. He leaned his head back, taking in her features as his smile grew wider. Yeah, I can see the similarities between her and Mrs. Underhill. If I didn't know any better, I would have said they were sisters. We get that a lot. The god swept a hand through his hair. Persephone was young when she had Melano. That and good genes, that must be it. Hades heard, ignoring the glare Melano was sending his way. His daughter wasn't keen on her alias. Tough luck. If I have to wear the name Hank, then so can she. So, where's the missus today? Naruto asked, glancing away from his notepad and pen. In front of him, Hades sat with the menu in his hands, his dark eyes peering up at him from the corners. As always, Hades was dressed in an immaculate black suit, though a dark red pocket square sat in the breast pocket. A skull ring made of gold wrapped around his index finger. The ring had been a gift from his wife after their wedding anniversary. The goddess of spring loved her jewelry, and while Hades was happy to accommodate with his endless supply of riches at his disposal, she surprised him one year by gifting him with the ring. Despite being the queen of the underworld, Persephone was not into the whole skulls and darkness look, despite how much he enjoyed the way it. Nice suit by the way. Armani thanks and a good eye, Hades praised. As for my wife, she is otherwise occupied. Away on business I see, the blonde replied. When's she coming back? It would be great to see her again. I'm sure you are, Hades said, lacking surprise in his voice. Persephone was well liked by most she came into contact with. Well, you may catch a glimpse of her from time to time if you're lucky. She splits her time between our business ventures and her family. Half the year she's with me, and the rest she's with her family and their business. She works closely with her mother. I see. The blonde caught wind of the way Hades spoke about Persephone's mother. Let me guess, you and your in-laws don't get along? The god of the underworld snorted, as did Melano. The goddess of ghosts sat quietly and listened as her father spoke with the mortal. It was strange watching a mortal have a normal conversation with her father. The man practically invented the word fear, and this guy was none the wiser. That would be an understatement, Hades replied. His hand toyed with the ring on his finger, twisting it around and rubbing the face with his thumb. Her mother despises my very existence. She holds me responsible for anything that goes wrong in her daughter's life, as well as her own. She sounds like a real piece of work. She is, though silent, Melano agreed with her father. Her relationship with the goddess of the seasons was non-existent. Despite her appearance resembling her beloved and favored daughter, Demeter had never reached out to her and Melano was never sure why. Her feelings towards the goddess were null and void. She didn't hate her, but she didn't feel any love for her either. Well, my father-in-law used to be the same way. He wasn't keen on me at first, thought his daughter could do better, but he came around over time, Naruto shared. He pictured Hayashi in his mind, wearing his famous stern scowl and Hyuga robes. He was a tough nut, but I wore him down. Maybe your mother-in-law will change one day. It's unlikely, but I respect your optimism, Hades said back, his dark eyes scanning Naruto's blonde ones. I think I'm ready to order. Meg. He couldn't stop his lips from twitching in a smirk when his daughter huffed her annoyance. Yes, I think I'm ready too then. Ladies first. Naruto looked at Melano and patiently waited for her response. Taking a final look at the menu, the goddess of ghosts placed it on the table. Do you serve breakfast food all day, or is it strictly for mornings? I do them all day. In that case, I'll get a stack of pancakes. Could I get half with blueberries and the other half with chocolate chips? Sure. He jotted the order down. Would you like a pot of syrup on the side? The dark-haired goddess nodded. The options were in the corner of the menu, and one stood out to her, the orange maple. You got it. Jotting it down, he finished by asking, and what would you like to drink? A coffee please. 2 sugars with cream. Nice and simple. I like it, he sent a smile her way, and the goddess couldn't help the edge of her lips twitch up. Across the table, Hades noticed it too and felt his lips twitch up, and for yourself his turn. Hades copied his daughter's actions by folding the menu and neatly placed it on the table. I think I'll take the amaretto coffee. His dark eyes glanced up at the blonde. I don't remember that on the menu last time. It's new. I added it the other week. So far it's been a hit with the customers. Naturally, the god thought. Hades doubted anything on the menu was going to leave someone dissatisfied. If gods like himself was pleased by what the blonde presented, then mortals were a no-brainer. With the coffee, I think I'll have the same as my daughter. Could I have maple syrup on the side please? And could I add banana slices and bacon with my pancakes? The blonde nodded. You can. Great pick, thanks. Taking their menus, Naruto gave a short bow. I'll be back with your orders shortly. The pair nodded and watched as the blonde got to work. Hades turned to his daughter. Well, he seems nice. For a mortal anyway. I can see why mother likes him. Hades hummed. Your mother has a soft spot for mortals with manners and talent, he admitted. It's not often I meet a mortal, much less a mortal man who doesn't appear bothered by my presence. Most would turn tail and run in the opposite direction. It's a refreshing feeling, I'm sure it is. The fear her father excluded from his powers could force mortals to have a heart attack on the spot if not controlled. The inside is nice too, though it could use some darkening, maybe black walls, or a dark purple. Some candles replacing the lights would give it a more rustic and Victorian theme, one of your favorite periods if I recall. You spent many years mingling with the mortals back then. Melano shrugged. Everyone was so easy to scare back then. Ghost stories were everywhere, and Victorian houses were perfect for haunting. Mortals were very gullible back then. It was my paradise. She sighed and leaned in her chair. Victorian England was so much fun. Giving them nightmares was so easy back then, and manipulating their mind to make them see things that weren't there was second nature. The mortal world got boring afterwards. If you behaved yourself, then you could have enjoyed it for longer. Do I need to remind you that if left to your own devices you would have exposed us? Hades reminded. A stern tone was laced in his voice. Let's not forget about that incident with your half-brother. Rolling her eyes, Melano let out a grunt. You're never going to let that go, are you? Her father sighed. A demigod during the height of the Victorian era, and the son of Hades had been a budding doctor back in the day. His talent and craft were enough to impress their father. It was rare to find a demigod son of Hades whose profession in life was saving lives, rather than taking them. Melano, on the other hand, saw it as a chance to have some fun with her half-sibling. Unseen from the shadows, she slowly plucked away at his sanity and didn't understand the damage she was imposing until it was too late. To say it didn't end well would be an understatement. You tormented your brother's mind for years, and it twisted him into England's most infamous killer. You got carried away, and in the end, Artemis and her hunters had to hunt him down and put an end to him before he took any more lives. The elder wrinkled his nose. I'm not one to give credit to one of Zeus's brood, but her actions were necessary, and she was right to take action. It didn't help that one of the women he killed had been a daughter of the love goddess. His interactions with Aphrodite was limited, but she'd given him an earful at that year's winter solstice. As annoying as she was, she did care for her children, and the unjust death of one had earned him her ire for years. I remember, Melano said quietly, crossing her arms and showing signs of remorse. I got carried away by the fear, and I didn't see what it did to him before it was too late. I've never let it happen again since then. I know not to get carried away. Her torment on the demigod was not her best moment. She regretted her actions. She would take it back if she could. She let her fun get carried away, and it ended with lives taken and her father dragging her back to the underworld. Across the table, Hades nodded and clasped his hands together on the table surface. In all fairness, compared to the bad deeds of the rest of our Olympian family, I'd say your track record is rather good. The gods of Olympus were far from perfect, and Hades included himself in that list. Even Persephone had moments she wasn't proud of. Some of the things the gods did to mortals, whether intentional or otherwise, were hard to imagine. In truth, the stories the world knew about them was barely scratching the surface when it came to their history with mortals. One blip is far better than anyone else in our family, excluding Hester of course. I'd say your slate is cleaner than most. I'm proud of you for not turning out like the rest of your Olympian cousins. Swallowing thickly, his daughter let out a small hum. Hearing praise from her father's lips was rare, and Melano tried her hardest not to stare owlishly at him. Maybe it was this place, it was making her father, dare she say, sociable. Why are you staring at me like that? Adjusting herself, Melano sat cross-legged on the chair, something her mother frowned at when sat around the dinner table. No reason. Though, I'm starting to think you're beginning to turn sappy in your old age. Watch it. Otherwise, this old man will spank you in front of every mortal in this room. You wouldn't dare. I really would. Melano humphed, though the edge of her mouth was tugging into a smile. Her old man could be bizarre sometimes. Falling quiet, The goddess turned her attention to their patron and eyed the blonde as he prepared their drinks. As the goddess of ghosts, her divine power when it came to the underworld was dwarfed only by her father. Her mother not so much, with Persephone's powers tied closely to the fertility of the earth. She adopted the powers of the underworld. Meanwhile, hers and her father were born with them. With her connection to the dead, and her divinity connecting to the spirits and ghosts' houses between the walls of the underworld, she felt when the souls were ruffled. When she was above ground, and when she focused on an individual mortal, she could feel all those tied to the people who rest within the underworld. This man's ghosts were old, very old, older than she ever sensed in a mortal before. It was bizarre. Melano hummed again. It's strange. Every ghost and spirit that passes through the underworld creates a thread, an attachment that links back to me. As the goddess who looks over the domain of ghosts, I can feel the threads stemming from him that link back to the underworld, and I can feel the threads attached to people in the underworld. The ones they share a bond or strong feelings towards in whatever form that takes. Her frown deepened. I can't put my finger on it, but the ghosts tied to him are old, older than I've ever felt. I'd have to make a trip past the Judgment Pavilion to find anything concrete. There were many levels to the area the souls of the mortals were kept and split into 3 sections. They were the Fields of Punishment, the Asphodel Fields and Elysium. A 4th existed and was known as the Isle of the Blessed. The number of souls that resided there was few and far between. The underworld was always expanding, making room for the influx of souls daily. In mortal terms, it was like a highway with new intersections forming and leading off to new areas housing souls. The further down you went, the older the souls that resided there. Her gaze returned to her father. If my suspicion is correct, then father hasn't noticed. She made a TSK sound with her mouth and looked away from the elder god. Honestly, he's become complacent in these years of peace. He can't see what's right in front of him. There didn't appear to be any evil intent. It was the opposite. The man had been a gentleman since her arrival and put her at ease. However, the blonde man presented a mystery for the goddess of ghosts and Melano wanted to unsolve the enigma. That was Naruto Uzumaki. Putting a pin on her suspicions, Melano straightened up when the blonde made a beeline for them. Gently placing 2 cups of steaming drinks on their table, Melano was quick to grab the handle and bring it up to her lips. Whoa, hold on. She heard and felt Naruto lean in next to her. It's hot, so make sure to blow on it first. I don't want you burning yourself. Her cheeks flushed at the statement, and she didn't need to look at her father to know he was smirking. She wasn't a child. Reining in her embarrassment, she gave him a subtle nod. Of course, thank you for warning me. Smiling, Naruto left to finish up their order, while Melano held up a hand to her father. Not a word. I didn't say anything. Then stop thinking too loud. I don't think that's a thing. Growling, Melano ignored her father and did as the mortal suggested, gently blowing on the top of her coffee. Melano let out a low hum of delight as the warm liquid passed through her mouth and down her throat. Gods, that was a good cup of coffee. The goddess didn't like her coffee too strong, but the way the blonde mixed it was perfectly proportionate to how she liked it. Not too sweet, not too bitter, and with the right amount of milk. Perfect. That's good. Surprised, Melano looked at her father, a hum of contentment reverberating from his mouth as he took a long swig of his amaretto coffee. His shoulders visibly slumped against his chair and watched as he tilted his head back and let out a sigh of relief. I needed this, she heard him say to no one and watched as a genuine smile tugged at his lips. Well, I'll be. This place did help her father relax. Not even the most qualified masseurs her mother had on standby in the underworld could make the god of the underworld sigh in contentment to such a degree. It wasn't long before Melano felt the mortal's presence at the table again, this time with 2 identical plates in his hands. Lowering both to the table, Melano tried and failed to stop her tongue from slipping out her mouth, salivating at the pancakes like a dog with a juicy bone. They looked delicious and were stacked 6 pancakes high. Warm butter sat in the center of the top pancake, with the yellow substance melting through the top layer. If Melano had to guess, he made them moments ago, since the chocolate from the chocolate chips were still in the process of melting. The goddess could only imagine the warm and gooey goodness that awaited her tastebuds. I can barely wait. Hades was in a similar state. Both father and daughter were eager to dig in. They didn't have to wait long. The second Naruto turned his back, Hades and Melano poured each of their syrups over the top of the pancakes. Somehow, they restrained themselves until the syrup flowed on each side of the stack. Before long, they were digging their forks in their meals. As soon as the pair felt the food hit their divine tongues, it was like fireworks going off inside their bodies. It was like their tastebuds were assaulted on every side of their being, an unrelenting wave of fluffy sweetness. Hades knew what he was in for, but Melano was caught off guard and couldn't stop her face from contorting into an expression of pure radiance. If one looked closely, you could see her pale skin gain a hint of color to it, and a dust of gold spreading across her cheeks. Beneath the table, Melano was tapping the floor with her shoes like a dog having its chin scratched. Oh my god, she thought, falling against the back of her chair while her hands continued to cut off pieces from her pancakes. "I've never tasted anything like this before. The best chefs in the underworld has nothing on this." Her home had the best of the best from every profession imaginable. On many occasions, her family would pluck a soul or two with exceptional skills to bedazzle them with their talent. In her long life, the goddess of ghosts could answer honestly and say no mortal had ever made such a meal this amazing. It was no wonder her parents liked this place. If this was the kind of food you received every time you visited, it was no wonder it attracted such attention. She bit her bottom lip, keeping a guttural moan from escaping her throat. The god and goddess stayed at the fox's den for most of the afternoon, ordering plate after plate of the pancakes and racking up a stack big enough for the other customers to take notice. Whatever foul mood Melano was in when she arrived earlier that day was gone and found herself enjoying her time in the mortal world for the first time in over a century. Hades, though his mind lingered on his wife, felt his misery subside. He was planning a future visit with his wife when she returned to Underworld in the autumn.